She was never supposed to be there. The wrong dress, the wrong girl. Hidden in a back room while her sister stood at the altar wearing Elena's name like stolen jewelry. But when the most dangerous man in Chicago walked through those chapel doors and looked past every carefully arranged lie, past the silk gown, the painted smile, the family's desperate gamble, and said 4 words that stopped every heart in the room. I asked for the seamstress. Nobody in that family would ever be the same again. If you've ever been overlooked, replaced, or told you weren't enough, stay with me until the end. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. The rain had been falling since Thursday. By Saturday evening, it had stopped being weather and started being something else. A mood, a pressure, a kind of atmospheric grief that settled over the city the way smoke settles into fabric. Elena Vale had grown up understanding fabric. She understood how it absorbed things, how it held memory, how a dress could carry the weight of everything that had ever happened to the woman who wore it. She was 31 years old, and she had never once worn a dress that was truly hers. The one she wore tonight, ivory, plain, high-collared, with a narrow satin sash at the waist. She had made herself, every stitch. 6 weeks of work done late at night when the rest of the house was asleep, and the only sound was the needle pulling thread through cloth and the occasional scratch of rain against the workshop window. It wasn't beautiful in the way that stopped traffic. It wasn't supposed to be. It was the kind of dress that held you the way a good promise holds you, quietly, without show, without fail. She sat in the small anteroom off the left side of St. Augustine's Chapel, which was not a chapel in the traditional sense but a converted Gothic hall that the Russo family had purchased 3 years ago and filled with Italian marble and candlelight, and the particular kind of silence that only money can manufacture. She could hear the organ from where she sat, low, sustained notes. Not quite music, not quite noise. Her hands were folded in her lap. She was counting stitches in her mind the way some women counted breaths. The door opened and her stepmother walked in. Margaret Vale was 63 years old and had spent 40 of those years perfecting the expression she wore now. Serene, assured, faintly apologetic in the way that powerful people are apologetic when they've already done the thing they're apologizing for. She wore charcoal silk. Her hair was set. Her jewelry was borrowed, which Elena knew because Elena had watched her pack it that morning from the velvet case that belonged to Elena's late father. "There's been a change," Margaret said. Elena looked at her. "Serena will go to the altar." 3 seconds of silence. "That's not what was agreed," Elena said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. She'd been practicing steadiness her whole life. "Mr. Russo's people were very specific. Mr. Russo's people asked for a Vale woman. Serena is a Vale woman." "Serena isn't—" Elena stopped, reorganized. "Serena isn't the one who made the arrangement. My father made the arrangement, with Matteo Russo's father, 22 years ago. It was specific. It was me." Margaret smiled. It didn't reach anything above her cheekbones. "Your father also thought a handshake was a binding contract, and look where that got him." The words landed the way Margaret intended them to, precisely, with maximum damage, in the soft place where Elena still kept her grief. Her father had been dead for 4 years. Heart failure, they said, though Elena had always privately thought it was more accurate to say he died of exhaustion, exhausted by debt, by Margaret, by the weight of obligations that stacked up around him like unpaid invoices, which was, in the end, exactly what this was. "She's already dressed," Margaret said. "She looks extraordinary. You know she does." Elena knew. Serena was 26, 5 inches taller than Elena, with the kind of angular face that photographers chased and the kind of composure that came from never once doubting whether she deserved to be looked at. She would look extraordinary in a flour sack. In the Russo dress, deep ivory silk with hand-sewn pearls across the bodice, a dress that Elena had not made, but that had been delivered in a white box 3 weeks ago, as if the Russo family had simply assumed beauty would be required. She would look like something sculpted. "This isn't your decision to make," Elena said. "It is now." Margaret moved toward the door and stopped with her hand on the frame. "Stay in here. I'll send Carmela with tea. This shouldn't take long." She left. Elena sat without moving for approximately 45 seconds. Then she stood, smoothed the front of her plain ivory dress, and thought about what she actually knew about Matteo Russo. She knew what the city knew, that he had taken over his father's organization at 29 when his father had a stroke at the negotiating table and never recovered, that he was 38 now and had not lost a significant conflict in nearly a decade, that he was described variously as ruthless, precise, humorless, and brilliant, depending on who you talked to and what they needed from him, that he had never been photographed with a woman at a public event, which people interpreted different ways. She knew what her father had told her, which was different. Her father had said Matteo Russo was a man who paid his debts and collected them with equal exactness, and that this quality above all others was what made him trustworthy in a world where trust was the rarest currency. And she knew what she had been told 3 months ago when a man in a charcoal suit arrived at the shop where she worked and sat down across from her work table and laid out the terms of an arrangement her father had made before she was old enough to understand what arranged marriages were. That Matteo Russo had agreed to absorb the Vale family's considerable debt, Margaret's gambling debt, Elena's stepbrother's legal debt, the loans on the house, in exchange for a marriage alliance. Not beauty, not spectacle. Elena. The man in the charcoal suit had been very clear about that. She had 3 options. She could stay in this room and drink tea while her sister married into a world that was supposed to be Elena's, for better or worse. She could try to stop the ceremony, which would cause a scene that Margaret would never forgive and which might not even work. Or she could wait and see what Matteo Russo actually did when he realized what had been done. She decided to wait. She was good at waiting. She'd had practice. The chapel held roughly 80 people. Elena could not see them, but she could hear the sound they made, the particular murmur of a crowd that knows it's watching something important. Matteo Russo's people took up the right side of the aisle, men in dark suits, women in subdued colors, everyone with the careful posture of people accustomed to being observed. The left side held the Vale family's network, which was thinner and noticeably less composed. Margaret's friends and associates, and the handful of people who had received invitations because declining them would have been uncomfortable. Serena would have walked in on the arm of Margaret's brother, Frank, who was the closest thing to a male authority figure the Vale side could produce. Elena knew the exact moment Serena reached the altar because the murmuring stopped. That was how it always worked with Serena. The room went quiet. Then, after 7 seconds, Elena counted, a different kind of quiet arrived, sharper, the kind that meant something had gone wrong. A single voice, low and distinctly unhurried. Stop. The organ died. Elena felt the silence travel through the wall. What? She heard the door to the anteroom open 11 minutes later. Not Margaret. The footsteps were different, heavier, slower, the walk of someone who never moved faster than they chose to. Elena stood up from the chair she'd returned to, and she turned to face the door, and Matteo Russo walked in. She had seen photographs. Photographs had not been adequate. He was not conventionally handsome in the magazine sense. His face was too angular, the jaw too heavy, the nose clearly broken at some point and reset imperfectly. He had dark hair with gray coming in at the temples, and eyes that were a particular shade of brown that Elena's mind filed immediately as the color of old bourbon, warm on the surface, with something considerably colder underneath. He was wearing a black suit that fit him the way expensive suits fit men who had been measured for them since adolescence, and his tie was dark charcoal, and he had his hands in his pockets. He looked at her for a long moment. "You're Elena, he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "You made that dress, She looked down at it, then back at him. "Yes." He nodded once, as if something had been confirmed. Then he looked around the small room. The single chair, the narrow window streaming rain-gray light, the folding table with the cold tea that Carmela had never brought, and something moved across his face that Elena couldn't quite name. It wasn't pity, it was more like recognition. "How long have you been in here?" "Since 6:30. He checked his watch. It was 7:52. "Sit down," he said. "I'd rather stand." A beat. "All right." He moved to the window and stood with his back half turned to her, looking out at the wet courtyard. She watched the line of his shoulders. He was a man carrying something heavy. Not the kind of heavy you could see, but the kind you could sense, the way you sense a current in still water. "Your stepmother thought I wouldn't notice," he said. "Did she? Or she thought I would, and it wouldn't matter." He turned from the window. "Either way says something interesting about how she sees me. My stepmother sees most people as problems to be managed. And what does she see you as?" The question was direct in a way Elena hadn't expected. She took a moment. "A liability that outlived its usefulness. I had skills she needed until she found a more attractive solution." Matteo looked at her steadily. "The skills or the marriage?" "Both?" He moved away from the window and stood closer. Not threateningly, but with the ease of a man who didn't think about personal space the way other people did, because personal space had rarely been something anyone enforced around him. Up close, she could see a scar along his jaw, thin and old, and the particular stillness of a man who had learned to control every unnecessary movement. "My father told me about your father," he said. 22 years ago, your father pulled 2 of my father's men out of a warehouse fire on the south side. Nobody asked him to, nobody paid him. He did it because they were trapped, and he had hands." He paused. "My father never forgot that. When he made the arrangement, it was because he wanted to give your father's family something real, not charity, structure, protection. My father died 4 years ago." "I know. And the debt is significant," Matteo said. "Your stepmother has a talent for acquiring obligations." A slight dryness entered his voice. Not quite humor, not quite contempt. "But the debt isn't why I'm here." Elena waited. "Your father had a quality," Matteo said. "He walked into a burning building for strangers. That's not instinct. That's character." He studied her face. "I wanted to know if it carried." The silence between them was different now. Not hostile, not comfortable either, just very honest. "And the woman at the altar?" Elena said. "Serena. Escorted back to your stepmother's side." He said it without inflection. "With my apologies for any confusion." Elena almost laughed. She stopped herself. "She's going to make your life very difficult." "She's welcome to try." "You don't know Margaret." "I know people who have made my life difficult," Matteo said. "They tend to stop." It wasn't a threat. It was a fact stated with the boredom of repetition, and somehow that was more unsettling than any dramatic delivery would have been. Elena looked at the man in front of her and thought about what it meant to know someone like this, to live inside the structure he'd named: protection, obligation, structure, and what it would cost and what it would offer, and whether those two things could ever balance. "I need to know something," she said. "Go ahead." "The arrangement. The original one." She kept her voice even. "What does it actually require of me?" Matteo was quiet for a moment. He had, she noticed, not yet looked away from her. Not at the room, not at the door, not at anything else. He had been looking at her with the same focused attention since he walked in, and it was the kind of attention that made you feel simultaneously visible and interrogated. "Presence," he said. "Loyalty. Discretion." A pause. "I'm not in the market for performance. What I need is someone I can trust at a table where trust costs everything. And in exchange, the debt, cleared, the house, yours, your work, whatever you do, wherever you do it, funded and protected for as long as the arrangement holds. And the arrangement ends when?" "That," he said, "is a conversation for later." The ceremony was quiet. 12 people witnessed it. Matteo's consigliere, a man named Doyle, whose face looked like it had been assembled from spare parts. 2 of Elena's cousins who had arrived at the chapel without understanding what they'd walked into. Margaret, pale and rigid as poured concrete. Serena, sitting 2 rows back in her extraordinary dress, with an expression that Elena had never seen on her sister's face before, and could only describe as the look of someone who had just discovered that the map they'd been following was somebody else's country. The official was a judge who owed Matteo a favor. The vows were standard. Elena's hands were steady when she signed the register. Matteo's were also steady, she noticed. When they left the chapel, the rain had stopped. The courtyard was wet and dark and smelled of iron and wet stone, and the cars were waiting with their engines running, and Elena stepped through the door into the cold air in her plain ivory handmade dress and her plain flat shoes and the very specific internal silence of someone who has just stepped off a cliff and not yet assessed the drop. Matteo walked beside her, not behind, not ahead. Beside. She registered that. "My things," she said, "already collected." She stopped walking. "You were confident." "I was prepared." He held the car door open. "There's a difference." She looked at him for a moment in the wet courtyard light. This man with the broken nose and the old scar and the empire balanced on something she didn't yet understand. And she got in the car. The mansion was in the north part of the city, set back from the lake behind a wall and a gate and several other layers of security that Elena clocked without appearing to clock them. The kind of security that was designed not to announce itself. The kind that meant something had required it. Inside, the house was not what she'd expected. She'd expected the Mafia movie version. Heavy dark furniture, oil paintings of ancestors, someone making espresso in the kitchen with a gun in their waistband. Instead, she found a house that was organized like a mind. Everything in its place. Nothing ornamental that wasn't also functional. Bookshelves in the hallway, and what appeared to be a climate-controlled archive room visible through a half-open door on the ground floor. The art on the walls was abstract and recent. The rugs were old and Persian and had been walked on by people who weren't worried about ruining them. A woman named Rosa met them at the door. 50, efficient, with the kind of face that had stopped bothering with expression sometime around 2005. She showed Elena to a set of rooms on the second floor. A sitting room, a bedroom, a bathroom, and through a connecting door, a workroom with a table and a good lamp and a window that looked out toward the lake. "This was empty," Rosa said, gesturing at the workroom. "Mr. Russo had it prepared for you." Elena looked at the table, the lamp, the window. "He knew what I did," she said. Not a question. "He knows most things," Rosa said, and left. She did not sleep well, not because of fear, or not only because of fear, but because her mind wouldn't stop moving, cataloging, processing. The workroom. The way he'd said presence, loyalty, discretion, the look on Serena's face, the scar on his jaw, the archive room downstairs, the scar again. At 3 a.m, she got up, wrapped herself in the robe that had appeared on the back of the bathroom door, and went to the sitting room window. The lake was black and flat and enormous, one of those Midwestern vistas that went on past sight. She stood there until her thoughts slowed. Then she heard it, soft, from somewhere below. The sound of someone moving through the house, deliberate, unhurried. She recognized the footstep weight and pattern now. She would, she thought, probably always recognize it. She turned from the window. She did not call out. She did not investigate. But she stood in the dark room for a long time afterward, listening to the mansion settle around her. The pipes, the old wood, the particular vocabulary of a building that held more secrets than rooms. And she had the first clear thought she'd had all day, which was this. There was something wrong in this house. Not with the man. Something around the man. Something he hadn't told her. Something she was going to find. The next morning, breakfast was laid in the dining room at 7:30. Black coffee, eggs, toast, a bowl of sliced fruit that no one had touched. Elena sat across the long table from Matteo, who was reading something on his phone and did not look up when she entered, but said, without inflection, "Coffee's hot." "Thank you." She poured it, sat. He kept reading. They ate in silence for 4 minutes. "I want to work," Elena said. He looked up. "Your shop." "I need somewhere to work. My tools. My clients' orders are behind because of—" She stopped. "Because of the last few weeks." "I'll arrange it." He returned to his phone. "Anything else?" Elena set down her cup. "Yes. I want to understand what I've walked into, what the house runs on, what the actual structure is." She paused. "I don't like operating blind." Matteo was quiet for a moment, and when he looked at her again, something in his face had shifted very slightly. Not softened exactly, but adjusted, like a lens refocusing. "After breakfast," he said, "I'll show you the archive room. She nodded, and she did not let him see that her pulse had jumped because he would know she'd noticed the archive room last night, and she wasn't ready for him to know how much she'd already been watching. The archive room held filing systems organized by year, by contract, by relationship. Physical paper and digital indexes running parallel. The kind of documentation that a legitimate business used to protect itself and that an illegitimate one used for different but equally compelling reasons. Matteo stood in the doorway while Elena walked the shelves. He didn't hover. He didn't explain things she could read herself. She pulled a fabric shipment manifest from the 2021 section, one of 3 related files. Looked at the numbers. Put it back. "What are these?" she said, keeping her voice neutral. "Import documentation, Russo Textile Holdings, legitimate arm of the business." He came into the room. "My grandfather started it in the 60s. Real business, real product. My father expanded it. And now? Now it runs under my CFO's management." He stopped beside her. "Why?" She turned and found him closer than she'd expected. Close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the slight asymmetry of his jaw where the break had healed. Close enough that she could tell, in the particular way you can tell with some people, that he was under stress he was not showing. "The numbers on those 3 manifests don't add up," she said. He looked at her. "The 2021 third quarter fabric shipments. The volume doesn't match the declared invoice totals. There's a gap." She kept her eyes on his. About $400,000 worth of gap. The silence between them was very clean and very specific. "You saw that in 30 seconds, he said. "I've been reading patterns since I was 8 years old." She paused. "I learned to sew. Sewing is math, proportion is math. And patterns, when they're wrong," she touched the edge of the file. "They look wrong to me the way a crooked hem looks wrong to most people. Just obviously off." Matteo looked at the files, then at her. "How many do you want to look at?" he said. "All of them," Elena said. And there was something in his face then, something that arrived and departed quickly, that she thought might have been the first honest thing she'd seen from him, and it looked, she decided, very much like relief. She didn't know yet what that meant, but she was going to find out. And somewhere in this house, in the numbers of those manifests and the gap that no one had named out loud, something was already beginning to unravel. She just didn't know yet how far it went, or who was holding the other end of the thread. She didn't move. That was the first discipline, the one her father had taught her without meaning to, by example, on every occasion when the world had decided to be worse than expected. You don't move. You breathe through your nose. You let your face settle into whatever expression costs the least energy to hold. You wait to understand what you're dealing with before you spend anything on reacting to it. The door behind her was still. Whoever was outside it had also stopped moving. Elena turned one more page in the file she was pretending to read. The page was a customs declaration from March 2022. She wasn't seeing the words. She was listening to the quality of the silence, whether it was the silence of someone who'd stopped to think or someone who'd realized they'd been heard. 4 seconds? 5. Then the footsteps resumed moving away down the hall, unhurried again, but with a different texture. The walk of someone who'd made a decision. She heard a door close somewhere on the far end of the ground floor. Not a slam. Careful. The kind of careful that told you the person behind it understood how sound traveled in old buildings. Elena exhaled through her teeth. She reached into the inner pocket of her robe and pressed her fingers against the folded page she'd hidden there. Still there. She'd palmed it during the 2 seconds when instinct had simply overridden conscious thought, not because she'd planned to take it, but because her hands had moved before her mind finished deciding, the way they moved when she was cutting fabric on a deadline, and her body knew the measurement before her brain had done the math. Old habit, new problem. She looked at the files remaining on the table. It was 12:41 in the morning. She had been in this room for over 4 hours. Her back ached from the chair, her eyes were dry, and she had found, in that time, 3 separate discrepancies across 2 years of textile import documentation. Gaps in declared shipment volume that someone had gone to the effort of distributing across multiple supplier accounts to keep any single irregularity below a threshold that would trigger automatic review. Whoever had done it was patient. Whoever had done it understood the system well enough to hide inside it. Whoever had just been standing outside that door had known she was in here. She closed the files, stacked them exactly as she'd found them, turned off the lamp. Then she sat in the dark room for a full 3 minutes, letting her eyes adjust and her heart slow, before she got up and walked to the door and opened it and stood in the hallway and looked both ways. Empty. She went upstairs. She did not sleep. At 6:15, she heard Rosa moving in the kitchen below. At 6:45, she dressed, the plain clothes she'd brought from home, dark trousers and a gray sweater, the kind of clothes that disappeared in a room. At 7, she went down. Matteo was already at the table. He was on the phone and he was not happy about whatever he was hearing, though his face showed it only in the jaw. A slight tightening, a millimeter of additional tension in a face that was already tight. He looked up when she entered, held up one finger, and continued listening. Elena poured coffee and sat. He finished the call and set the phone face down on the table. Picked up his own cup, drank. "You were in the archive until past midnight," he said. Not a question. So someone had told him, or he'd checked. "I was," she said. "Find anything else?" She looked at him over the rim of her cup. The page in her pocket, she'd transferred it to the inner seam of her trousers before coming downstairs, stitched in place with 2 pins, pressed very slightly against her hip. "I need more access," she said, "specifically to the 2022 and 2023 subcontractor records. The filing system has gaps." "What kind of gaps?" "The kind where a file should be and isn't." His eyes held hers. "I'll ask Doyle." "I'd rather you didn't." That landed. She watched it land. He set down the cup with a care that was its own kind of deliberateness and studied her with the undivided, slightly uncomfortable attention she was starting to recognize as his default when something had surprised him. "Why?" he said, flat, not angry, just a request for information delivered in the fewest possible syllables. "Because I don't yet know who to trust in this house," she said, "and until I do, I'd prefer that my questions stay between us." The silence was long enough to be a real silence, not a pause. "All right," he said. She nodded. She finished her coffee. And neither of them mentioned the footsteps in the hall, or the door that had closed softly at 12:41 in the morning, or the fact that they were both clearly operating on less sleep than was good for anyone. "Oh, right." Doyle arrived at 9. His full name was Connor Doyle, and he was 54 years old and had been Matteo Russo's consigliere for 11 years. Having come up through the organization from the ground level, collections, enforcement, then operations management, then the particular administrative intelligence that a man like Matteo required from the person nearest him. He was large without being imposing, with a face that managed the rare trick of looking both forgettable and deeply watchable, the face of a man who had spent years being underestimated and had stopped minding. He found Elena in the sitting room off the main hall, where she had set up at the writing desk with a legal pad and was working through a set of numbers from memory. He stopped in the doorway. She didn't look up. "Mr. Doyle." "Mrs. Russo." His voice was careful, not unfriendly, the careful of a man who didn't know yet what she was. "Sit down if you want." He sat in the chair across from her. She kept writing. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Sure." She looked up. "The textile subcontractors from 2022. There's a name in the Q3 manifest, Verona Logistics. I can't find a corresponding file in the archive." His face did nothing. This was, she noted, the kind of nothing that required effort. That account was closed. It'd be in the closed account storage separate section. "Which you manage." "Which I manage, yeah." "Can I see it?" "I'd need to check with—" "Mr. Russo has already authorized the access," she said. It was technically true. Matteo had said I'll arrange it and asked Doyle, and she had said she'd rather not. And he had said all right, which she was interpreting as authorization for direct access by alternative means. This was, she acknowledged privately, a generous interpretation. Doyle looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who had just had a door closed in his face, but wasn't sure exactly when it happened. "I'll pull the file," he said. "I'd appreciate that." She returned to her pad. This afternoon would be fine. He left. She waited until his footsteps faded, then set down the pen and looked at what she'd written. The Verona Logistics account appeared in 3 separate manifests, declared fabric shipments totaling just under $900,000 over 7 months. No corresponding records in the standard filing system. A closed account designation that would explain the absence without requiring explanation. Except that the declared shipments had generated import duties, and import duties generated government documentation, and government documentation had to be held for a minimum of 7 years. If Verona Logistics was a real company, the paperwork existed somewhere. And if it wasn't, she folded the legal pad closed. If it wasn't real, someone had been moving money through a ghost account under Matteo Russo's textile operation for at least 2 years, and doing it with the access and knowledge required to file convincing paperwork and then disappear the records into a closed account archive that nobody was supposed to look at. That took either Matteo himself or someone very close to him. She thought about the footsteps at 12:41. She thought about Doyle's careful face. She picked up the pen again. The file arrived at 2:15, delivered not by Doyle, but by a young man Elena didn't recognize. Early 20s, dark hair, moving with the suppressed nervous energy of someone who'd been given a task they weren't comfortable with. He set the manila folder on the desk beside her, said, "Mr. Doyle sends it with his apologies. He had another meeting," and left before she could respond. She opened the folder. Inside were 3 pages. They were clean and professionally formatted and completely convincing, and they were also, Elena was nearly certain, printed within the last 48 hours. She could tell because of the paper. Old document paper had a particular quality, not quite yellowing, but with a tone, a weight, a slight brittleness at the edges that came from sitting in filing systems for years, absorbing ambient moisture and time. These pages were white, not bright white, the inkjet white of things printed this morning, but white enough. White in the way of something that had been run through a drawer to give it texture but hadn't been aged by actual drawers. She sat with them for a long time. Someone had known she was looking for the Verona Logistics file. Someone had prepared a substitute, and the substitute had arrived via Doyle. She photographed each page with her phone, put the phone away, closed the folder, and set it neatly to one side. Then she sat with her hands flat on the desk and thought about what her options were and how many of them involved telling Matteo Russo what she'd found. The answer, she decided, was eventually all of them. But not yet. Not until she knew which direction the danger was coming from, because the danger was coming from somewhere inside this house, and she did not yet have enough to know whether Doyle was acting alone or whether his careful face and his prepared documents represented something larger and more organized than one man's instinct for self-preservation. She needed one more thing. She needed to find the real Verona Logistics records. She found Matteo in the room he apparently used as an office. Second floor, north end of the house. Walls lined with more of those bookshelves. A desk that looked like it had been in the family for generations. A view of the wet garden below. He was standing at the window when she knocked. "Come in." She came in, closed the door. "Doyle sent me a file," she said. "The Verona file. He mentioned it." "It's not the real file." Matteo turned from the window. "The paper's new," she said. "Printed recently. The aging is cosmetic." She paused. "Someone knew I was asking." He was looking at her with the bourbon dark eyes doing the thing they did when he was processing. Very still, very focused, the kind of stillness that was not calm but was its disciplined cousin. He moved away from the window and sat on the edge of the desk. This was, she was learning, his version of pacing. He didn't pace, he relocated, choosing positions in a room with the unconscious tactical habit of someone who'd spent years thinking about exits. "He would have needed to move fast," Matteo said. "You asked for it this morning." "I know." "Which means he has the documents ready, staged." He said the word with the flat precision of someone biting into a piece of fruit and finding it wrong inside. Or someone prepared them for him. Does Doyle have that kind of access? To the archive? To the system? He manages it. A pause. He built most of it. They looked at each other. "How long has he been with you?" Elena said. 11 years. "And before that?" 3 years with my father." He rubbed the back of his neck. A small, tired gesture. the first physically unguarded thing she'd seen from him. 14 years total. And you trust him? I trusted him. The past tense arrived quietly, without drama, and settled in the room like something heavy set down on a wooden floor. Elena sat in the chair across the desk without being invited to. I need access to your financial system, she said. The actual system, not the archive. I need import duty records cross-referenced with the declared shipment volumes. If Verona Logistics filed real paperwork with a government port authority, there'll be a record that doesn't run through Doyle. Matteo studied her. You know how to navigate a financial system. My father's business had import accounts. I managed his books from the time I was 17. She met his eyes. And I know what numbers that are lying look like. They look the way fabric looks when someone's cut it on the wrong bias. Straight to the eye until you hold it up to the light. Something moved across his face. Not the relief from yesterday. Something rawer than that. He's been with me 14 years, Matteo said again. Not to her, quite. More like saying it out loud to hear what it sounded like. I know, she said. I'm sorry. He looked at her sharply, as if the apology surprised him, as if he hadn't expected her to know that this was the kind of thing you needed to be sorry about. Let me look at the system, she said. Give me 3 days. I'll either find something or I won't. And if you find something, then you'll know what you're dealing with before you act. She paused. Acting before you know costs more. He was quiet for a moment. I'll get you the access tonight, he said. What? Dinner was the three of them. Elena, Matteo, and Adrian Voss. She hadn't met him before. She'd heard his name, mentioned by Doyle in passing that morning as someone whose office coordinated with the textile holdings, but she hadn't placed a face to it, and when he arrived at the dining room at 7:30, she spent the first 90 seconds simply cataloging him the way she cataloged everything, systematically, without letting the catalog show on her face. Adrian Voss was 43, well-made, the kind of lean that came from actual physical maintenance rather than genetic luck. He had light eyes, gray or green, the candlelight made it hard to determine, and fair hair going silver at the sides, and the easy, practiced confidence of a man who had been good-looking since his 20s and had learned to use it the way some men used height. He was Matteo's second-in-command. He had been, she learned over the course of the meal, in that position for 6 years. He was also the most attentive person at the table. Not to Matteo, to her. I have to say, Adrian said, pouring wine he hadn't been asked to pour, we weren't expecting anyone quite like you. What were you expecting? Elena said. Honestly, a slight smile. We weren't given much information. Matteo tends to... He glanced at Matteo across the table, an affectionate, collegial glance. Keep his personal business personal. That hasn't changed, Matteo said. He was eating. He did not look up. Of course. Adrian turned the smile back to Elena. What I mean is that we're glad you're here. The house has been, well, it's been a working house for a long time. It'll be good to have someone in it who isn't primarily focused on the business. Elena looked at him. I'm fairly focused on the business, actually. A beat. Is that right? I spent last night in the archive, she said pleasantly. Fascinating records. Your textile division has very interesting documentation habits. Adrian's smile didn't change. That was the tell. When someone who smiles easily hears something that should alter their expression, and the smile just stays, maintained through whatever internal mechanism they use, that was the tell. She'd seen it in clients who were slow to pay. She'd seen it in her stepmother every time the subject of money came up. I wasn't aware you had an interest in finance, he said. I have an interest in patterns, she said. It's a professional habit. Matteo lifted his eyes from his plate and looked at Adrian and then at Elena with an expression that communicated nothing and was therefore communicating a great deal. Elena's a seamstress, he said. One of the best in the city, apparently. He said it with a straightforwardness that was almost theatrical, the tone of a man dropping a perfectly ordinary remark into perfectly ordinary conversation. She sees structure in things. It's useful. Adrian looked at Matteo. Something passed between them, quick, complex, the traffic of two men who had known each other for years and had developed shorthand, and then Adrian nodded and said, "Of course," again, and returned his attention to his food. Elena picked up her fork. Useful, Matteo had said. She registered the word and stored it. Okay. After dinner, Matteo walked her to the archive room. He unlocked a second cabinet she hadn't had access to before, retrieved a laptop from inside, set it on the table, and typed in a password that he shielded from her view out of habit, and then, visibly deciding something, didn't bother shielding. Financial system, he said. Full access. Import records, duty filings, all subcontractor accounts including closed accounts. He straightened. Verona will be in there somewhere. Thank you. He moved toward the door. Voss, she said. How long has he been second? 6 years. And you trust him? It was the same question she'd asked about Doyle. Matteo stopped at the door and looked back at her and said nothing for a moment, and she thought she could see him doing the arithmetic, what he'd trusted, what he thought he'd known, what the last 24 hours were doing to those calculations. I trusted the work, he said finally. I should have been more specific. He left. She opened the laptop. She found it at 11:47, not in the Verona logistics account, which was as scrubbed as she'd expected. The real records gone. The substitutes Doyle had provided the only trace. But in a cross-reference she hadn't planned to run, import duty filings at the Port Authority level, matched against a separate subcontractor account under the name Castellan Freight that appeared in the 2023 records only for 3 months, then vanished. Castellan Freight had filed real paperwork, real government documentation, and the declared shipments matched almost exactly the volume gaps she'd identified in the 2021 Verona records. Same money, different name, different year. The same underlying pattern, adjusted and displaced the way a seam is shifted when a garment is altered. The structure identical, just moved. She sat with this for a long time. Castellan Freight's registered contact address was a postal box in the South Loop. Its filing authorization, the name that appeared as the authorized representative on the port documentation, was not Doyle. It was an initial and a surname that she stared at for a full minute before she understood it. A. Voss. She pushed back from the table and stood up. Her legs were not quite steady. She was not afraid exactly. She was something more precise than afraid. The feeling of a floor that has been solid for as long as you've been standing on it, giving the first faint tremor of something structural and wrong far below. The feeling of understanding, too late, that the problem was never where you were looking. Doyle had staged the decoy because Doyle knew she was asking. But Doyle had known because someone had told him. And whoever had been standing outside this door last night had known she was here because they'd been watching. And they'd been watching because finding her in this archive at midnight was exactly what they'd been afraid might happen. Not because she was Matteo's wife, because she could read the numbers. Adrian Voss had wanted Serena at that altar. Not because of beauty, or status, or family alliance, because Serena would not have spent last night in an archive. Serena would not have noticed the paperweight. Serena would not have run a cross-reference on Port Authority duty filings at 11:47 on a Tuesday night and found a name that shouldn't be there. The replacement had never been an insult. It had been a plan. She photographed the screen. She photographed it 3 times from different angles. She closed the laptop and sat in the dark with her hand flat on the closed lid and thought about what she was going to do next and how much time she had and whether the person who had been outside this door last night would come back tonight and what they would do if they did. She thought about Matteo's face when he'd said, "I trusted the work." I should have been more specific. She thought about 14 years and 6 years and what those numbers meant to a man who built his empire on loyalty the way other men built it on force. She picked up her phone. She looked at the photographs, clear, clean, undeniable. She thought about going upstairs and knocking on his door and showing him right now, tonight. She thought about what Adrian Voss would do if he knew she'd found it before she had the chance. She thought about the door at 12:41, the footsteps, the decision she'd heard a person make in the silence before they walked away. They hadn't come in last night. Tonight she'd been here longer, found more. The laptop had been accessed. Even if she'd closed everything properly, a system could log access timestamps. If Doyle was watching the system, and she had to assume Doyle was watching the system, he would know within the hour. She had, at most, until morning before Adrian Voss knew exactly what she'd found. She stood. She put the phone in the inner pocket of her trousers, against the seam, pins in place. Then she turned off the archive room light and stepped into the hallway and stood in the dark and listened to the house. Quiet. Old wood. Pipes settling. Then, a sound from the far end of the ground floor. Not footsteps. Something else. The soft, compressed sound of a phone call taken on silent. A voice kept low enough that you couldn't hear words, only the rhythm of them. Coming from behind the door she'd heard close last night. Doyle's office. She stood absolutely still. The voice stopped. A chair moved. Then footsteps from, faster than last night, coming toward the hall. Elena turned and went up the stairs without running, moving on the balls of her feet, one hand on the banister, using the muscle memory of a woman who had spent years moving through a house without disturbing anyone, because disturbing anyone had consequences. She reached the second-floor landing and moved down the hall to Mateo's door and knocked. 3 knocks. Not loud. 2 seconds. 4. 6. The door opened. He was awake. Still dressed. Jacket off, but the shirt and trousers still on. The bourbon eyes taking her in and the situation in and the absence of her usual composure in one measured sweep. "Doyle's on the phone," she said, keeping her voice below carrying distance. "His office, right now." Mateo's jaw tightened by a single measured millimeter. "What did you find?" he said. Not a question. He knew she'd found something from the way she was standing in his doorway at midnight for the second night in a row. "Castellan Freight," she said. 2023, Port Authority duty filings, authorized contact. She held up her phone and showed him the photograph. He looked at it. The name. A. Voss. His face did not change. It did not change in the way that a very cold, very deep body of water does not change when something heavy breaks the surface. The stillness held, perfect and complete, while everything underneath rearranged itself into something unrecognizable. "How much?" he said. 2 years of documented transfers. Based on the volumes, somewhere between 1.2 and 1.8 million. She kept her voice level. "And that's only what I found. The full extent is larger." "Almost certainly." He looked at the photograph for another moment. Then he handed the phone back to her and said, "Stay up here." "Mateo." "Stay up here," he said, and something in his voice was the most honest thing she'd heard from him yet. Not anger, not the controlled precision she'd catalogued as his default register. Something beneath that. Something that sounded like a man who had just been shown a wound he hadn't known he was carrying. He walked past her toward the stairs. She stood in the hallway and listened to him go down, and she thought that she should have more to say, that there was something useful she should be doing, that this was the moment when having found the thing she'd been looking for was supposed to feel like a victory. It didn't. It felt like standing at the edge of something that had been set in motion long before she'd arrived and watching the first of many dominoes fall, and knowing that the ones after it were larger and heavier and falling toward something she couldn't yet fully see. From below, she heard a door open. A voice. Mateo's, stripped of everything but the essential. Then Doyle's, louder, startled. Then a third voice. Adrian Voss. He was already in the house. He'd been here the whole time. Elena pressed her back against the wall of the hallway and understood, with the cold clarity of someone who has just found the third discrepancy in a pattern she should have seen from the beginning, that tonight was not the beginning of the problem. She counted the voices, 3 of them, below. Mateo's. Lowest, the most controlled, the one doing the least volume and therefore the most damage. Doyle's. Higher, reactive, with the particular pitch of a man who has been caught mid-sentence doing something he'd planned to finish before anyone noticed. And Adrian's. Smooth, almost pleasant, the voice of a man who had rehearsed for exactly this conversation and was now performing his rehearsal with the calm of someone who believed his preparation was adequate. Elena stood against the hallway wall and counted and breathed and thought about what she had and what she didn't have and what the distance was between those two things. What she had. Photographs on her phone. The cross-reference she'd run. The substituted documents from Doyle. The page she'd folded into her pocket on the first night. She'd read it 3 times since then and knew what it contained, which was a shipping manifest for a Verona logistics delivery that listed a receiving address on the west side of the city that she had not yet been able to identify. What she didn't have: any clear sense of how much Matteo already knew, or suspected, or had been refusing to see. Any certainty about what Adrian had in place for exactly this contingency. Because a man who had been running a ghost account under his own initial for 2 years inside someone else's organization had contingencies. That was not a man who improvised. That was a man who built systems, the same way she built garments, with the understanding that every seam would eventually be tested. From below, Adrian's voice rose for the first time. Not loud, just firm. The firmness of someone making a point they'd made before and were tired of being required to repeat. Then silence. Then a single sound she couldn't identify. Something dense and heavy connecting with something else, the sound cutting off fast. Then nothing. Elena moved. She went down the stairs the same way she'd come up. Balls of her feet, one hand on the banister, no wasted motion. She was not running toward the sound. She was moving because standing still when she couldn't see what was happening was a kind of blindness she'd decided she couldn't afford. The ground floor hallway was lit by 2 wall sconces on dimmers. The light was amber and thin and made everything look like it was happening in a memory rather than in the present. She reached the bottom of the stairs and looked toward Doyle's office. The door was open. She approached it along the wall, shoulder to the plaster, until she could see inside without being fully in the frame. Doyle was sitting in his desk chair with both hands on the armrests, very still. There was a cut above his left eye, not deep, but bleeding in the committed way that head wounds did, and he was breathing through his nose in a controlled, deliberate way that meant he was managing pain and trying not to show it. Rosa was not in the house. Her hours ended at 9, and she slept in a separate structure behind the garden. There was no one else on the ground floor visible. Matteo stood in the center of the room. Adrian was to his left near the window, in the relaxed posture of a man at a drinks party who has just made an interesting point. "The account," Matteo said. His voice was so quiet that Elena had to concentrate to hear the words. "Walk me through the account." "There's nothing to walk through," Adrian said. "Castellan Freight is a legitimate holding. It was set up to... The authorized contact is your initial and your name. A clerical error on the port filing, which I flagged internally months ago." He was smooth, genuinely smooth. The smoothness of a man who had spent 6 years learning exactly how Matteo spoke and thought, and what would and wouldn't get past him, and who had prepared his explanations accordingly. "Doyle can confirm. The account has been flagged for correction." Doyle said nothing. His hands on the armrests were very white at the knuckles. "Doyle can confirm," Matteo said, as if tasting the phrase. "Can he?" "Ask him." Matteo looked at Doyle. Doyle looked at the desk. "He already confirmed something else," Matteo said, "about a document he sent to Elena this afternoon." Adrian's expression didn't change. The smile held, that tell again, the one she'd clocked at dinner. But something behind his eyes moved. "The woman has been here 3 days," Adrian said, "and she's already running through your financial records at midnight. You don't find that worth examining?" "I put her there." "I understand that. What I'm saying is..." "What you're saying," Matteo said, "is that I should be looking at her instead of at you." The room went very still. Elena was watching Adrian's right hand. It was at his side, relaxed, fingers loose. The fingers tightened by 2 degrees. "Matteo," Adrian said, and the smoothness was still there, but something underneath it had shifted, the way a road shifts before it breaks. Imperceptible on the surface, and then, suddenly, not. "I have been with you for 6 years. I have managed every significant operation this organization has run in that time. I have sat across from people who wanted to take what you have, and I have protected it. I have stolen from it," Matteo said. Silence. Not the silence of a pause, the silence of a word landing in a room and taking up all the available space. Adrian looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the door, at Elena. She hadn't moved. She was standing in the doorway with her shoulder 2 inches from the frame, and she looked back at him and did not look away, and the calculation in his gray-green eyes was the most honest thing she'd seen from him yet. Honest the way a predator is honest, without performance, just the clean arithmetic of threat and response and available options. "There she is," he said softly. "The seamstress." "Come in," Mateo said to her. Not a request. She came in. But, what happened in the next 4 minutes happened fast. Adrian moved toward the door, not running, just walking with purpose. The walk of a man who had decided his current position was no longer tenable and was executing a pre-planned exit with the mechanical confidence of long rehearsal. Mateo stepped into his path. They were nearly the same height, and Mateo was broader, and what happened next was brief and not elegant, and ended with Adrian against the wall with Mateo's forearm across his chest. Elena had not moved from beside the desk. She was watching Doyle. Doyle was watching the floor. "The receiving address," Elena said. Doyle looked up. "Verona Logistics. The manifest from March 2022. Receiving address on the west side." She kept her voice the same temperature as the room. Flat, functional, with no heat that could be used as a handle. "I need to know what's at that address." Doyle's eyes went to Adrian, pinned against the wall, and then back to Elena. He was doing the arithmetic. She could see him doing it, the math of a man who had made a bet that was losing and was assessing what could be salvaged. "Doyle," she said, just his name, nothing else. "The way you said someone's name when you wanted them to understand that you were the steadiest thing in the room." He said the address. Elena looked at Mateo. Mateo looked at her over his shoulder, and something passed between them in that look. Not warmth exactly, but its functional equivalent, the recognition of two people who are, for the moment, on the same side of something. He let Adrian step back from the wall. Adrian straightened his collar. His face had changed. The party ease was gone, replaced by something older and more real, a kind of focused, calculating stillness that was in some ways more alarming than anger would have been. "You don't know what you're doing," he said, addressing her, not Mateo. "I know what I found," she said. "You found numbers. You don't know what the numbers represent." "They represent money that moved through your accounts instead of this organization's accounts," she said. "And a document substitution that was prepared before I even finished asking for the original." She looked at him directly. "Those two things alone are enough." "Enough for what?" His voice had gone very cool. "You're going to go to the authorities? You're married to a man who can't go within 50 feet of law enforcement without a lawyer present. You don't have the infrastructure to—" "I'm going to go to the table," she said. He stopped. "The syndicate table," she said. "Whatever council structure governs how disputes between members are handled." She kept her eyes on his. "I assume there is one. Organizations like this one don't survive without internal dispute resolution." Adrian looked at Mateo. "You're going to let her speak to the table." "She's my wife," Mateo said. Simply. As if that answered everything. As if it were, in fact, the only answer the question required. The calculation in Adrian's eyes ran all the way through. "Then we have a problem," he said. They kept him in the office under Mateo's watch, while Elena went back to the archive room and worked. She worked for 2 hours. She was past tired in the way that you get past pain when something more urgent is present. The adrenaline burning through the exhaustion, her hands steady on the keys, her mind moving with the narrow, concentrated focus of someone who knows they have a limited window and cannot afford a single, imprecise step. She built a document. Not a report. She'd never written a formal report in her life. What she built was what she knew how to build. A pattern. Laid out the way you'd lay out a cutting diagram. Each piece in relation to the others. Nothing wasted. The whole structure visible from above if you stood at the right angle. Every identified transaction. Every matched record. The Verona account. The Castellan account. The relationship between them. The substituted documents and the timeline of their substitution within 6 hours of her first inquiry, which meant a monitoring system on the archive that Mateo hadn't authorized. The receiving address Doyle had given her, which she had run against public records during the first hour, and found registered to a shell company whose registered agent was a law firm she didn't recognize but whose incorporation address was, notably, the same South Loop postal box as Castellan Freight. She printed it. All of it. on the archive room printer, which was old and loud in the night-quiet house, and sounded, in the dark, like something much more significant than paper moving through a machine. When she came back to the office, Rosa had arrived. Elena had not heard her come in. She was there, coat still on, face with its permanent expression of having witnessed everything and registered nothing, holding a phone that she handed to Matteo without comment. He looked at the screen, and his jaw did the millimeter thing again. "What?" Elena said. He showed her the screen. It was a photograph, time-stamped 40 minutes ago, from a security camera on the north perimeter of the property. The gate. A car leaving. Not Adrian's car. Adrian was still in this room. A dark sedan she didn't recognize, moving without its lights on until it reached the street. "Who?" she said. Matteo looked at Adrian. Adrian looked at the middle distance with the serene expression of a man who has just played the card he'd been holding. "I told you," he said quietly. "You don't know what you're doing." Rosa made coffee. No one asked her to. She simply made it, set it on Doyle's desk in 3 cups without bothering to ask who wanted what, and stood near the door with her coat still on as if she were prepared to leave at any moment. Elena drank hers standing. Her back was a solid column of ache from the archive chair, and she didn't want to sit down because sitting felt, right now, like a concession she couldn't afford. "The car," Matteo said. He was speaking to Doyle, who had stopped bleeding but was going to have a notable bruise above his eye by morning. "Who was in it?" Doyle pressed his lips together. "Connor." The use of the first name was deliberate. She could hear the deliberateness, the way Matteo had chosen it specifically, deploying 14 years of shared history like a tool. "The car," Doyle said. "Mira Vance." Elena turned to look at him. Mira Vance was, as far as Elena knew, the name of the woman who managed accounts receivable for the Russo Textile Holdings. She had a small office on the 4th floor of the textile building downtown. Elena had seen her name on the organizational chart that Matteo had shown her on her second morning in the house. "She manages accounts receivable," Elena said. "She manages what looks like accounts receivable," Adrian said from the wall where he'd been standing since the photograph. "What she actually manages is considerably more specific." Matteo looked at him. "Explain." "I'd rather demonstrate." Adrian straightened his collar again. That gesture, the composed reset after physical contact, the reminder that he'd decided to perform composure and would continue to perform it regardless of what the room was doing. Collar. She just left this property without authorization at 1 a.m. Call her anyway. The silence was the kind that happened when a room full of intelligent people all arrived simultaneously at the realization that the person they'd been managing had, in fact, been managing them. Matteo called. 3 rings. 4. Then a voice. Female, unhurried, with the faint accent of someone who had grown up speaking 2 languages simultaneously and had never fully committed to either. "Put it on speaker," Adrian said. Matteo did. "Ms. Vance," he said. "Mr. Russo." A pause. "I've been expecting this call. Where are you?" "Safe," she said. "Which is the relevant information, I think." Elena looked at Adrian. He was watching Matteo's face with the careful attention of a man watching something he'd arranged begin to execute. "Mira," Adrian said toward the phone. "Tell him what you told me." Another pause. Longer. The quality of it changed. No longer the pause of preparation, but the pause of someone deciding in real time how much truth to spend. "The textile holdings," she said. "The import accounts. The gap between declared volume and actual revenue." Her voice was even, precise. The voice of a woman reading from a document she had written herself and memorized thoroughly. "It's not the first time someone has run numbers through this organization without the primary partner's knowledge." Matteo's hand tightened on the phone. "The primary partner," he said. "The Ferrano Group," she said. "Specifically, Marcus Ferrano, who has had a revenue-sharing arrangement with this operation for 3 years, documented in accounts that are not in the archive you showed your wife, and not in the system she accessed tonight." A breath. "Accounts that Connor Doyle has been maintaining separately at Mr. Ferrano's request, since before Mr. Voss was brought into the arrangement." Elena looked at Doyle. Doyle was looking at his hands. "This isn't about me," Adrian said, and his voice had finally shed the last of its party smoothness, the last of the rehearsed ease. And what was underneath it was colder and more angular than anything she'd seen from him. "It never was. I found the secondary accounts 8 months ago. I've been documenting them. Mira has the documentation." He looked at Matteo with something that might have been, in a different context, something close to pity. "The money I moved through Castellan was mine. It was a hedge. Because I knew what Ferrano was building, and I knew when it came apart, it was going to come apart on you, and I needed to be somewhere other than inside it when that happened." The room was very quiet. "You stole from me," Matteo said, "as a hedge. I diverted funds. Funds that, given what's coming, you would not have had access to for much longer regardless." He held Matteo's eyes. "Marcus Ferrano has been skimming this operation for 3 years with Doyle's cooperation. The amount is somewhere north of $4 million. He has documentation designed to implicate you, to make it look like you authorized the arrangement. And he has been building a case with a federal contact for the last 14 months. Elena's mind went very still. Federal. She looked at the document she'd printed, the careful pattern she'd laid out across 2 hours of work in the archive room, the pattern she had been preparing to take to a syndicate table that Marcus Ferrano, if what Adrian was saying was true, had already compromised. "The table," she said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. Adrian looked at her. "The table meets Friday, he said. 4 days from now. Ferrano controls 4 of the 7 seats through relationships that Doyle helped him build over the last 2 years. He paused. "If you present what you found to that table, you will be presenting it to Marcus Ferrano, who will have his federal contact mobilized within the hour." Elena set down her coffee cup. She set it down very carefully, with both hands, because she needed something to do with her hands that didn't involve them shaking. She looked at the document she'd built. The pattern. The thing she'd been certain 2 hours ago was the weapon they needed. It was still accurate. Every number, every cross-reference, every matched record, all accurate, all real. And in the hands of the wrong people, every accurate, real piece of it was a shovel. "The receiving address," she said, her voice steadier now. She was pulling herself back the same way she always pulled herself back. Through the work, through the specific, through the next precise step. "The West Side address from the Verona Manifest. What's there?" Adrian looked at Doyle. Doyle looked at Adrian, and his face showed, for the first time tonight, something that wasn't managed or performed or strategically deployed, just the plain, exhausted look of a man who had made a choice 3 years ago in what seemed like a practical direction and had been carrying the weight of it ever since. "A storage facility," Doyle said. "Ferrano's people use it for physical documentation. The original copies." He pressed his lips together. "Everything is there. Contracts, correspondence, the arrangement records, every signature." "Including the ones designed to implicate Matteo," Elena said. "Yes." She looked at Matteo. He was standing very still in the center of the room in the amber light, and he was looking at the phone in his hand, and the look on his face was the thing she'd been watching for. The thing underneath the controlled precision and the bourbon dark eyes and the careful tactical positioning. He looked like a man who had built something over a long time, stone by stone, in the particular solitude of someone who didn't fully trust other people to handle weight, and who had just discovered that the foundation had been undermined so methodically over so long that he hadn't felt it happening until it was nearly done. It was not a look she could afford to spend too long on. "The facility," she said. "Is it guarded?" "2 men on overnight rotation," Doyle said. "Ferrano's people." "Access." "Keypad. I have the code." He stopped, looked at his hands again. "I've been there. Several times." "Of course you have," Matteo said without inflection. Doyle flinched. It was a small flinch, the flinch of a man who had decided at some point that the thing he was doing was manageable and had been living inside that decision for so long that its real weight had stopped feeling like weight and had started feeling like just the way things were, until the moment someone said the obvious thing out loud, and the full mass of it dropped on him at once. Elena looked at the time on the archive room printer, 2:47 in the morning. If we're going to get to that facility before Ferrano knows we know about it, she said, we need to move in the next 2 hours, before his people change rotation at 5. 3 men looked at her. She looked back. I'm the only one in this room, she said, who Ferrano's people have never seen. She kept her voice factual. You, Doyle knows your face and Ferrano knows your face. Doyle is not an option for obvious reasons. Adrian, she glanced at him, may or may not be known to them, but given that he just told us he's been building his own hedge against this situation, I'm not in a position to assess his reliability for a task that depends on exactly that. You're not going to a Ferrano facility, Matteo said. I'm going because I'm the only viable option, she said, and because I know exactly what I'm looking for. I built the pattern. I know what the documents look like. I know what to take and what to leave. She held his eyes. I can be in and out in under 20 minutes if Doyle gives me the code and a description of the layout. You've been married to me for 3 days. I'm aware. Elena, Matteo. His name in her mouth for the first time. She'd been avoiding it, she realized, using the distance of not naming as a way of maintaining the precise professional separation she'd been operating from since the chapel. I found the numbers. I built the case. Everything we have exists because I spent 3 nights in your archive and I noticed the things that were wrong. She did not raise her voice. Let me finish what I started. The silence was different this time. Not hostile, not resistant. The silence of a man doing an accounting that had nothing to do with money and arriving at a number he hadn't expected. Doyle gives you the code, he said, and the layout. And the layout. He looked at Doyle. And if anything goes wrong, then I'll handle it, Elena said. She did not know at this moment whether that was true. She did not know what handling it would look like or require or cost. She knew that she was standing in a room at 2:47 in the morning in a house that had turned out to be considerably more compromised than she'd understood when she walked into it, and that the careful, precise, well-documented case she'd built over 3 nights of work had just been handed to her as a weapon that could as easily be turned around. And she knew that the only way through was forward, because backward no longer existed, and sideways was a story that ended in a federal building with someone else holding all the documents. She looked at the printed pages in her hand, the pattern, the seams. She thought about the dress still hanging in her workroom upstairs, the hidden pockets she'd sewn into it the same week she'd agreed to the arrangement, not because she'd planned anything, but because her hands had done what her hands always did, which was prepare for the things she didn't yet know she was going to need. Give me the code, she said to Doyle, and something in the room, in all 3 men in the room, shifted. Not toward her. Not exactly. More the way a room shifts when someone opens a window. The air changes direction, and the change is not comfortable exactly, but it is real, and it is necessary, and everyone present understands that the room is different now from what it was before. She was different. She had been, since the chapel, trying to manage this, to be useful, to be careful, to be precise, to be the thing the arrangement required without becoming more than that, without letting the situation press her into a shape she hadn't chosen. She had been, she understood now, operating as someone observing a crisis from close proximity. She was no longer observing. She put the printed pages under her arm and held out her hand to Doyle for the code. He gave it to her. She wrote it on the inside of her left wrist in ballpoint pen, pressed hard enough that the ink would last. Then she went upstairs to change into the darkest clothes she owned, and she did not look at the dress hanging in the workroom, and she did not let herself think about what happened if she got to that facility and found it already empty, the documents already moved, Ferrano already 3 steps ahead, the way men who built things for years over other people's foundations tended to be. She thought about the receiving address from the March 2022 manifest. She thought about the pattern. She thought about the specific, disciplined knowledge that every seam, however hidden, could be found by someone who knew what to look for. Then she thought about the fact that Adrian Voss, still downstairs, had said she didn't know what she was doing. She pulled on her darkest sweater, her dark trousers, her flat-soled shoes. She pressed the code on her wrist with 2 fingers, checking it was still legible. She went to the workroom and opened the small cabinet under the table where she kept her tools, and from the back of the cabinet, behind the pincushions and the measuring tape and the box of specialty needles, she took the things she had put there on her first morning in this house, a folding knife, 3 inches closed, that her father had given her when she was 19 years old and which she had carried in every workroom she'd ever had because he'd told her that a woman who worked alone at night needed to be able to open boxes, and that had been his way of saying something else entirely. She put it in the pocket she'd sewn into the inner seam of her trousers. Then she went downstairs and out through the kitchen door and into the cold before dawn dark of the city, and she did not look back at the house, because looking back was something you did when you still had the option of returning to where you'd been, and she had understood, finally, fully, and without comfort, that that option had closed behind her sometime in the last hour without her noticing exactly when. The street was wet and empty, and the city made its low, continuous noise around her, and she walked toward the car that Mateo had arranged, Rosa's cousin, apparently, who asked no questions and drove with both hands on the wheel. And she sat in the back seat in the dark and looked at the code on the inside of her wrist and thought, with the particular clarity of someone who has run out of time for anything but the essential, she was going to a building she'd never seen in the middle of the night to steal documents from a man who had spent 3 years building a case to destroy the person she'd been married to for 72 hours. She pressed her back against the seat, breathed through her nose, and thought about what it meant that, of every person in that room, she was the one most capable of doing this. Not because she was brave, but because she was the only one who had not yet been seen. The only one Ferrano had not planned for. The only piece of the pattern that didn't fit the shape he'd spent 3 years cutting. The car moved through the dark city, and Elena Vale, who was now Elena Russo, and who was still not entirely sure what that meant or what it would cost, kept her eyes on the window and her hand in her pocket, and her breathing exactly as slow as she could keep it, because slow breathing was the thing that kept you thinking, and thinking was the only weapon she had ever reliably trusted. The west side came up gray and wet through the window. She looked at the address. Then the car slowed, and she looked at the building, and something in the quality of the dark around it, the particular absence of the 2 guards Doyle had described, made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up before her mind had finished processing why. The facility was already lit inside. Someone was already there. And the car was still moving toward it, slowing. The car stopped, not because the driver had decided to, because Elena said stop in a voice that didn't negotiate, and her hand was already on the door handle before the word finished leaving her mouth. And the driver, Rosa's cousin, whose name she didn't know and hadn't asked, pressed the brake with the instinctive compliance of someone who understood, in the particular animal way that people understood things at 3 in the morning, that the woman in the back seat had just seen something that changed the situation. The facility was a converted warehouse. Single-story, flat roof, loading dock on the east side. The windows were high and narrow, and 3 of them on the south face showed light. Not overhead fluorescence, something lower and more mobile. The light of flashlights or portable lamps moving behind frosted glass. There were no cars parked at the front. This was, Elena understood immediately, not an absence of cars. This was cars parked elsewhere, deliberately. The 2 guards Doyle had described were not at their posts. This meant either they'd been paid to leave or they were inside, which were 2 different problems with 2 different implications, and she had approximately 45 seconds to determine which before whoever was in that building finished what they were doing. She got out of the car. "Wait here," she said to the driver. "If I'm not back in 30 minutes, leave." She didn't wait to see his response. She crossed the street at an angle, not straight toward the building, cutting east along the shadow of the facing wall, moving on the flat soles of her shoes across wet pavement that reflected the orange of the streetlights back at her. Her breath came in small clouds in the cold air. She made herself breathe through her nose. She counted her steps because counting was the thing that kept her mind from running ahead to the 10 different ways this could go wrong. She reached the east side of the building. The loading dock door was closed but not locked. She could see from 6 feet away that the padlock hasp was hanging open, the lock gone. Recent entry. Someone with a key or someone with bolt cutters and enough time. She stood with her back to the wall beside the dock door and listened. Inside, movement. Multiple people. The particular acoustic signature of a large empty space with people in it. Sound bouncing off concrete floor and metal shelving, voices kept low but not low enough to disappear entirely. 2 voices. Maybe 3. She reached into her pocket and felt the folding knife. 3 inches closed. She didn't open it. She held it. Then she put her other hand on the dock door and pushed it open 3 inches and looked through the gap. The facility's interior was one large room with a grid of metal shelving units running parallel down its length. The shelving held filing boxes, rows of them, labeled in a system she couldn't read from this angle. At the far end, near what appeared to be a secondary office space with a glass partition wall, 3 portable LED work lights had been set up on the floor, their beams aimed upward to diffuse the light without directing it at the windows. 2 men she didn't recognize were working through the filing boxes with the systematic efficiency of people who had been given a list and were checking items off it. They wore dark clothes. They did not speak to each other. And in the glass-partitioned office at the far end, visible through both the partition and the gap in the dock door, sitting at a metal desk with a laptop open and several file folders arranged in front of him with the proprietary ease of a man reviewing his own property, Marcus Ferrano. She knew him from the photographs in the archive. 61 years old, with the thick, settled build of a man who had been strong in his 40s and had let the strength soften but not disappear. Silver hair kept short. He wore what appeared to be a very good suit at 3 in the morning, which told her something about the kind of man he was. The kind who dressed for events rather than times of day. The kind for whom every situation was a performance requiring appropriate costume. He was reading. She watched him for 10 seconds, cataloging the room the way she cataloged fabric, looking for the structure beneath the surface, the pattern that told her what she was actually working with. The 2 men on the shelves were extraction, not guard detail. They were pulling specific boxes, not searching, which meant they had a list, which meant they'd known what they needed before they arrived, which meant someone had told them. She thought about Mira Vance in a car without headlights, leaving the Russo property at 1 in the morning. She thought about the phone call, speaker mode, Mira's precise voice. "I've been expecting this call." She thought about Adrian's face when Matteo had put the call on speaker, the satisfaction he hadn't quite managed to keep out of it. She pressed her back against the outside wall and looked up at the wet sky and did the math. Adrian had told her the truth about Ferrano and the federal contact and the $4 million in Doyle's cooperation. She believed that because a man building a hedge didn't lie about the thing he was hedging against. The lie was in the presentation of himself as the solution, not the problem. Adrian had diverted money. Adrian had also, she now understood, diverted Mira Vance, had used her, or been used by her, or some combination of the two, to ensure that when the confrontation in Doyle's office happened, when the cards came onto the table, the one card that mattered was already in play. Mira had called Ferrano from the car, within minutes of leaving the property, which meant Ferrano had known for almost 2 hours that the archive had been accessed and that someone had found the cross-reference. He'd moved immediately to the facility to pull the documents, the physical originals, the ones Doyle had confirmed were here, the ones with the signatures and the correspondence, and the everything that could either destroy Matteo or, in Elena's hands, save him. She had maybe 10 minutes before they finished and left. She had a folding knife and the code on her wrist and the layout description Doyle had given her, which was now approximately 40% accurate given that the layout of a room changed considerably when there were 3 people already in it. She needed to think. She had, she estimated, 30 seconds in which to think. She used them. The secondary entrance was on the north face of the building. Doyle had mentioned it as a fire door that opened from the inside on a push bar. What he hadn't mentioned, but what she could see when she moved along the north wall with her shoulder barely clearing the brickwork, was that the fire door was propped open with a rubber wedge, the kind of wedge you found in every commercial building in the city, the kind that maintenance workers used and forgot, and which became, over time, simply part of the landscape of the building. Someone had propped it open on their way in, which meant it hadn't triggered an alarm, which meant the alarm system, if there was one, was either disabled or this door was on a separate circuit. She went in. The north side of the facility was darker. The work lights were all at the south end, and she was coming in behind the shelving grid, which meant 3 rows of metal shelving stood between her and the 2 men working through the boxes. She moved along the wall in the dark with one hand trailing on the shelving to keep her oriented, her feet making no sound on the concrete, her breathing controlled to the point where she could feel the control in her chest, the slight muscular effort of keeping each exhale below audible. She could hear the two men clearly now. They were speaking in short, functional exchanges. Box numbers, yes, no, set it aside, working through a checklist. She watched the sweep of their flashlights through the gaps in the shelving and timed her movement to the moments when both beams were directed away from her row. She needed the office. Ferrano's laptop and the folders on the desk. To get to the office, she needed to cross approximately 40 feet of open floor between the end of the shelving grid and the glass partition wall. 40 feet of open floor lit by 3 LED work lights, with two men who would have clear sightlines to it the moment they looked up from the boxes. She stood at the end of the shelving grid and looked at the 40 feet and thought about the only option she had, which was not a good option, but was the only one available, which was in her experience the definition of most options. She stepped out. She walked. Not fast. Fast drew the eye. She walked at the pace of someone who belonged in the space, with the shoulder set and chin angle of someone whose presence required no explanation, because she had learned a long time ago that the human eye, when it catches peripheral movement, makes an instant decision about whether to escalate into full attention based almost entirely on whether the movement looks like it belongs. She was a woman in dark clothes walking through a warehouse at 3 a.m, and she walked like she'd done it every night for years, 15 feet. One of the men glanced up. His flashlight tracked left, away from her. 25 feet. The other man pulled a box and set it on the floor and squatted to open it and was completely occupied. 35 feet. She reached the glass partition and pressed herself to the wall beside the office door, which was also open, and looked through the glass at Marcus Ferrano, sitting 6 feet away at the metal desk. He had not looked up. He was reading a document, reading it with the full, careful attention of someone who needed to know exactly what it contained, not skimming, not reviewing, reading. His left hand was flat on the desk beside a phone that was face up and active, the screen showing what appeared to be a text conversation. She looked at the folders. 4 of them, stacked to his right. The top one open. The laptop screen showed a spreadsheet she recognized. The structure of it, the column arrangement, was the same basic architecture as the Verona account she'd spent 3 nights studying. Ferrano's version. The complete version. She looked at the two men at the shelving, both currently occupied. She looked at Ferrano's phone, face up, screen active. She could not take the laptop without him seeing her. She could not take the folders without him seeing her. She stepped through the office door. He looked up when she was 2 feet inside the room. His reaction was not what she expected. Not alarm, not the physical startle of someone caught by surprise. He looked at her with the measured, assessing calm of a man who had been doing dangerous things for a long time and had developed the professional discipline of evaluating threats before responding to them. He took approximately 3 seconds. Looking at her face, her posture, what she was and was not carrying visibly. Then he said, "You're the seamstress." His voice was even. The voice of a man confirming a detail. "Yes," she said. "Russo sent you." "I came," she said. "There's a difference." He leaned back in his chair. The chair was metal and it made a sound against the concrete floor. A small industrial scrape that was very loud in the quiet. "How did you find this place?" The March 2022 manifest. Verona Logistics. The receiving address. She kept her own voice level. She was aware of the two men at the shelves, aware of the distance between her and the desk, aware of the phone face up with its active screen and whatever conversation was on it. "You left a thread." Something moved through his face, not quite amusement, something close to it, the expression of a man who appreciated precision even when it was being used against him. 1 thread. It was enough. He looked at her for another moment. Then he called out, without raising his voice significantly, "Tomas." One of the men at the shelving stopped moving. "Come here." Footsteps. The man named Tomas appeared in the office doorway behind her. She heard him rather than seeing him, heard the specific displacement of air that a large person created when they entered a small space. She did not turn around. "She walked in on her own," Ferrano said to Tomas, mildly, "which is either brave or stupid." He looked at Elena. Which is it? Necessary, she said. He picked up his phone, looked at the screen, set it back down, face up. Russo knows you're here. Yes. And he sent his 3-day wife into a building full of my people instead of coming himself. He tilted his head slightly. What does that tell you about his confidence in the situation? It tells you what he wants you to think. She kept her eyes on his. He's not here because being here would give you what you need. A confrontation between Russo and Ferrano at this location, at this hour, is the kind of thing that ends up being described by your federal contact as evidence of ongoing criminal enterprise. She let that sit for 1 second. Me being here is different. I'm a woman who wandered into a storage facility at 3 in the morning. I'm not on any organizational chart. I'm not in any surveillance file. I'm a seamstress. Verano looked at her with the expression of someone recalibrating. You're also, he said slowly, the only person in Russo's circle who's read the numbers. Yes. Which means you're the only person who can explain them to a table. Yes. And you think coming here accomplishes what, exactly? Not sarcastic, genuinely asking, the question of a man who respected operational logic and wanted to understand hers. You have documents, she said, physical originals, signatures, correspondence, arrangement records, all of it designed to implicate Matteo Russo in an arrangement he didn't know about. She kept her voice absolutely flat. I have documentation of the actual arrangement, the Verona accounts, the Castellan cross-reference, the Port Authority records. Enough to show the table exactly who moved what and when and under whose authorization. She paused. Neither of us can use what we have without the other using what they have. Right now we cancel each other out. Tomas, behind her, shifted his weight. Ferrano was quiet. What I'm proposing, she said, is a different arrangement. But she did not get to finish proposing it. The dock door hit the wall. Not opened. Hit, with the full kinetic force of someone coming through it fast and not concerned with quiet, and the sound bounced off the concrete and the shelving in a wave that compressed the air in the space, and Tomas turned toward it instinctively, and Elena moved. She grabbed the folders from the desk with her left hand, all 4, in a single sweeping motion that caught the edge of Ferrano's coffee cup and sent it off the desk, ceramic hitting concrete with a sound like a small detonation. And she was already turning for the door when Ferrano's hand came down on her wrist. His grip was hard and immediate, the grip of a man who had grabbed people before and knew how to do it with finality. She stopped, turned to face him. He was standing now, his chair pushed back, and up close, he was larger than he'd seemed sitting. The thickness of him, the particular solidity of a man whose softened strength was still, when deployed, considerable. Put them down, he said. Her wrist was in his hand. Her other hand, the right one, was in her pocket. From the main room, shouting, sudden and overlapping. 2 voices she didn't recognize. Then a third she did. Matteo's, stripped to its absolute minimum. The voice he used when he was done with words that weren't essential. He had come. Of course he had come. She looked at Ferrano's hand on her wrist and then at his face, and she said very quietly, I'm going to need you to make a decision. I already have, he said. Make a different one. The sound from the main room escalated. Something falling, metal on concrete, the particular acoustic signature of a physical confrontation in a space full of hard surfaces. She heard Matteo's voice again and then a sound that made her jaw tighten, the sound of impact, the specific dull percussion of force connecting with a person. Ferrano heard it too. His eyes moved toward the sound for 1 fractional second. She used it. Her right hand came out of her pocket with the folding knife, and she didn't open it because opening it would have changed what she was doing into something she hadn't decided to do yet. Instead, she pressed the closed knife into his hand, into the hand that was gripping her wrist. And she felt him feel it, feel the shape and the weight of the implication, and she looked him in the eye and said again, different decision. The grip loosened by a degree. She pulled her arm back, stepped back, kept the folders. The documents on this laptop, she said. Her voice was doing something extraordinary, she thought, which was remaining functional. I need them. You need... Ferrano made a sound that was almost a laugh. the involuntary response of a man who has been surprised past his usual parameters. You need my laptop. The financial records, the complete version, the one that shows the full arrangement. She kept her eyes level with his. With those and what I have, the picture is complete. Without them, what I have is half a pattern, and half a pattern is just fabric. It doesn't mean anything. The main room had gone quieter, a different kind of quiet, the quiet after rather than the quiet before. Verano looked at her for a long time, with the assessing stillness she was starting to read as his default, the same quality she'd clocked at 3 seconds when she walked in. Threat assessment, always. Always threat assessment, the constant orientation of a man who had navigated by it for 30 years. You're going to the table Friday, he said. Yes. And you think what you have will hold against 4 votes. I think the table will vote on what they're shown, she said, and I intend to show them something they can't argue with. She took a breath. You built a case to bring down Matteo Russo. I'm not asking you to abandon it. I'm asking you to consider that the case you built is based on records that show Matteo's signature on an arrangement that Doyle facilitated without his knowledge, and that if I stand in front of that table with the complete record, yours and mine together, the signature reads differently. Differently is an exoneration. No, but it's reasonable doubt. And in the room you're planning to use Friday, reasonable doubt is the same as exoneration. She paused. You know that. He looked at the folders in her arm. He looked at the laptop. He looked at her. Then Matteo walked through the office door. He had a cut on his cheekbone. Not deep, but fresh, bleeding in a thin line that he hadn't bothered to address. His jacket was gone. His shirt was torn at the shoulder seam. She noticed the torn seam with the automatic professional attention she couldn't turn off even now. And he was breathing with the controlled, deliberate rhythm of someone managing adrenaline, keeping it functional rather than letting it run. His eyes went to her first. A single full sweep, checking, not for injury exactly, but for status, for intact, for still standing. Whatever he found seemed to be sufficient because he looked at Ferrano's second. And when he did, his face was the face she'd seen in Doyle's office when he'd read the name on her phone. Not anger. The thing below anger. The thing that was colder than anger and considerably more dangerous because it didn't need to perform itself. Marcus, he said. Matteo. Ferrano's voice was calm. The calm of a man deciding in real time where this went. Your man Tomas has a problem, Matteo said. He's handling it. Ferrano looked at the main room through the glass partition and then back at Matteo, and something moved through his face. The rapid calculation of a man resetting his assessment of available options. He looked at Elena. He looked at the folders under her arm. Your wife, he said to Matteo, came in here and took my documents and told me to make a different decision. Matteo looked at Elena. She looked back at him. Did she? He said. And she wants the laptop. Matteo was quiet for a moment. The blood from the cut on his cheek had reached his jaw, and he reached up and pressed his thumb against it without looking away from Ferrano. A brief, functional gesture that addressed the blood without addressing the wound. Here's what I think, Matteo said. He moved into the room. Not toward Ferrano, just into the room, occupying it differently. I think you've been running a case for 14 months based on documents Doyle helped you build. I think the case is solid as built. I also think it's built on a foundation that my wife just handed me the ability to pull. He paused. Which leaves you with a federal contact, a strategy, and no case. I have 4 seats at the table, Ferrano said. You have 4 relationships, Matteo said. Relationships change when the information does. He looked at Elena. Show him. She set the folders on the desk and opened the top one and turned it toward Ferrano. The cross-reference. The Castellan records. A. Voss. That's the man who's been in your ear for the last 2 years, Matteo said, telling you what to move and when, steering you toward a position where you'd take on the risk of moving against me while he stood back. He paused. The federal contact. Is it actually yours, or did Voss introduce you to them? The quality of Ferrano's stillness changed, just slightly, just enough. He introduced you, Matteo said. Didn't he? Verano looked at the cross-reference. At the name, A. Voss. He looked at it for long enough that it was its own kind of answer. The contact, Elena said, quietly, may not be what you were told they were. Verano looked at her. A federal contact that was handed to you by the man who was running ghost accounts through your competitor's textile holdings is a liability, she said. Not an asset. She kept her voice free of anything that could be read as pressure. Whatever case you filed, whatever material you provided, you need to know who actually received it. The room was very quiet. Verano looked at the laptop. He looked at the folders. He looked at Matteo and then at Elena, and the assessment was running. She could see it running. The long, cold arithmetic of a man who had been in dangerous positions before, and knew the specific topography of the moment when an exit strategy became more valuable than the ground you were holding. He sat back down. He turned the laptop so its screen faced her. The complete records, he said. Every account, every transfer. He looked at her directly, and for the first time he wasn't assessing her. He was looking at her the way people looked at things they'd underestimated and were revising. You can copy what you need. She set the folders down. She pulled the folding knife from her pocket and set it on the desk between them. She sat down across from him and reached for the laptop, and he watched her do it with the expression of a man watching something he hadn't predicted occur exactly as it was occurring. Friday, she said, without looking up from the screen. I'll need until Friday. You have until Friday, he said. Matteo stood in the doorway of the glass office and pressed his thumb against the cut on his jaw and watched her work. And she was aware of him watching, aware of the particular quality of his attention. Not protective, not possessive, not the watching of a man who needed to monitor what was happening. The watching of a man who was, she thought, doing the same thing he'd done when he walked into the anteroom in the chapel and found her there in the plain ivory dress she'd made with her own hands. Seeing what was actually in front of him. She found the Verona original records on the laptop, the complete set, 3 years of actual data that Verano had received from Doyle and preserved. And she began to copy them, methodically, file by file, with the steady hands and the absolute focus of someone who understood that what she was doing right now was not just copying files. She was rebuilding a pattern. She was taking the cut pieces that had been hidden across 3 years and 4 accounts and 2 men's ambitions, and she was laying them out on the table the way she laid out a cutting diagram, each piece in its correct relationship to the others, until the whole became visible, and the whole was something no individual piece had been able to show on its own. Her hands moved across the keyboard, and outside the glass partition, the main room was quiet, in the way that rooms were quiet after things had been decided. And Matteo's blood dried on his jaw, and Verano watched her work with the expression of a man recalibrating everything he'd thought he understood about what walked into his building tonight. She had the files. She had until Friday. She had 4 days to stand in front of a table where 4 of 7 seats belonged to a man who had just handed her his weapon, and she needed to walk in there with something so complete and so precise and so undeniable that even the people who were paid to look away would not be able to make themselves do it. She needed to build the thing that ended this. She copied the last file and closed the window and looked up at Matteo across the room, and he looked back and neither of them said anything because there was nothing to say yet, nothing that wouldn't be inadequate to the specific weight of this moment. This 3 a.m. moment in a West Side warehouse with the cold coming in through the propped fire door and the LED lights making everything look like an interrogation, and the folders on the desk and the name on her wrist fading where the pen had smeared against her sleeve. She stood up. She picked up the folding knife and put it back in her pocket. She picked up the folders. She looked at Verano. Friday, she said. Friday, he said. And she walked out of the glass office, past Matteo, and through the main room where Tomas was sitting against the base of the shelving, with the specific look of someone who had finished making bad decisions for the evening. And she walked to the dock door and through it and out into the cold, wet air of the city. And she stood on the pavement and looked up at the sky that was beginning at the eastern edge to show the first pale, exhausted gray of a day that had not yet decided what it was going to be. Her hands were shaking, not badly, not visibly, probably, to anyone who wasn't looking for it, but she felt them. The fine, internal tremor of adrenaline that had been held down for too long and was now making its presence known in the only way left to it. She pressed them flat against her thighs. Breathed. Matteo came out behind her. He stood beside her on the pavement and looked at the same gray horizon, and he had the torn shoulder and the dried cut and the breathing that was still doing the controlled, deliberate thing. And for a moment they just stood there in the cold that way. Two people who had just been through the same fire, from different angles, and had come out the other side still standing, which was not the same as coming out unburned. "You gave him your knife," Matteo said. "I gave him the suggestion of my knife," she said. "There's a difference." He looked at her. "Did you actually have a plan when you walked in there?" he said. She thought about it honestly. "I had an assessment and a direction. Plans require more time than I had." He was quiet for a moment. "You said you'd handle it," he said. "If something went wrong." "Something went wrong." "Yeah." A pause. "You handled it." She looked at the folders under her arm, the laptop files on the drive in her pocket. The weight of 4 days and a table and 7 seats, and 4 of them hostile, and everything she'd built and everything she still had to build. "I need your workroom," she said. "It's yours. I need 4 days with no interruptions. Doyle's access revoked from the system. Voss contained." She looked at him. "And I need to know who the other 3 seats belong to, and everything you know about them, and I need it by tomorrow morning." He looked at her for a long time with the bourbon eyes doing the very still, very focused thing. Then he said, "What are you going to make?" And she said, "Something they can't look away from." And the gray morning came up over the city, and the lake beyond it, and the wet streets, and the particular exhausted silence of 4:30 in the morning, and Elena Vale, Elena Russo, stood on a west side pavement with stolen documents under her arm and a folding knife in her pocket, and 4 days to build the thing that would either save an empire or finish burying it. And she thought about thread and tension and the specific. She slept for 3 hours, not because she had finished, but because her body made the decision without consulting her. One moment she was at the workroom table with the files spread out and the lamp burning and the city going gray to gold outside the window. And the next she was waking up with her cheek against the back of her hand and a crick in her neck that would stay with her for 2 days, and the specific disorientation of someone who fell asleep inside a problem and woke up still inside it. The files were still there. The lamp was still on. The city outside was fully morning now. 7:43 by the clock on the wall, a clock she hadn't noticed before. Plain white face, the kind that schools used, the kind that made you aware of every second. She sat up. She pressed both hands against her face. She breathed. Then she went back to work. The thing she was building was not a report. She had decided this on the drive back from the west side, sitting in the dark of the car with the folders and the drive and the gray morning coming up, while Matteo sat beside her and said nothing and let her think. A report was a document that required its reader to trust the person who wrote it. A report asked for belief. What she was building was not asking for anything. What she was building was the thing itself, the complete record, every thread laid out in its correct relationship, the whole pattern visible at once, so that the only response available was to see it. She'd built it before. Not like this, not at this scale, not with these stakes, but the same principle, garment construction. The way you took individual cut pieces, none of them resembling on their own the thing they would become, and arranged them on a flat surface in a specific order, and showed the person watching what each piece was and where it fit, and how the whole was made from the sum of them, until what had seemed like chaos became, inevitably, a shape. She worked on the Ferrano records first. His complete files gave her what she'd been missing, the original Verona logistics documentation, unaltered, showing the actual flow of funds over 3 years. Compared against the substituted documents Doyle had produced, which she'd photographed and preserved, the difference was a before and after that required no explanation. The substitution was its own proof. You didn't replace a document unless the original said something you needed to hide. She built the timeline, not in words, in columns, parallel, the way fabric costs were laid out in a production sheet, date, account, declared amount, actual amount, the delta between them, the authorizing signature. Doyle's name appeared 41 times. Marcus Ferrano's accounts appeared in the background of 18 transactions. Adrian Voss's initial appeared 5 times, always in the years after the arrangement was already established. A latecomer, she understood now, who had found the running operation and inserted himself not as architect, but as opportunist, diverting a stream that was already flowing. And Mateo's name appeared nowhere. Not once. Not on a signature line, not in correspondence, not as an authorizing contact. The arrangement Ferrano had built his case around, the one designed to implicate Mateo, required Doyle's cooperation to function, and Doyle had been careful, she saw, in a particular way. Careful enough to keep Mateo's name off the physical documents while keeping him close enough to the organization that a narrative of culpability could be constructed around the proximity. It was elegant, in the way that traps were elegant. It required only that no one look too closely. She printed the timeline. She looked at it for a long time. Then she got up and went downstairs and found Rosa in the kitchen, and asked, simply, for coffee and whatever Rosa thought was appropriate to eat, and Rosa looked at her for one moment with the expression that was Rosa's version of concern, a slight focusing of the eyes, a barely perceptible tightening at the corners of the mouth, and said, "Sit down," and made eggs. Elena sat at the kitchen table and ate and drank coffee and looked at the wall and thought about 4 seats and 3 seats and what the difference between them was and how to make it insurmountable. Mateo came in at 9 with the information she'd asked for. He sat across from her at the kitchen table. Rosa had retreated to the back of the house with the specific tact of someone who understood when a room needed to be smaller, and he laid out 3 pages of handwritten notes. His handwriting was small and precise, the handwriting of someone who'd learned it as a discipline rather than an expression. "The 3 seats," he said. "Hannigan, Kowalczyk, Osei." She looked at the pages. Patrick Hannigan, 68, second-generation organization, independent operator on the North Side who had maintained a careful neutrality in every significant syndicate dispute for 20 years. He owed Mateo no particular loyalty, but owed Ferrano none either. His primary concern, historically, was stability. He voted with whoever he calculated would keep the most predictable environment for his operations. Renata Kowalczyk, 55, the only woman on the table, who had inherited her seat from her husband and spent 8 years proving it was more hers than it had ever been his. She had a reputation for being unmovable once she decided, and for deciding based on evidence rather than relationship. She had not, to Mateo's knowledge, had significant dealings with either him or Ferrano in the past 2 years. Daniel Osei, 47, newest member of the table, 3 years in the seat, who had come up outside the traditional organizational structure and whose presence at the table represented an expansion of the syndicate's scope into financial operations that the older members still hadn't fully processed. He was numbers-oriented, in the way that people who had built legitimate financial businesses before crossing into illegitimate ones tended to be. He valued documentation. Elena read through the 3 pages twice. Then she folded them and held them in both hands. "Hannigan wants stability," she said. "Kowalczyk wants evidence. Osei wants the numbers to be real." She looked at Mateo. "What I'm building gives Osei everything he needs and Kowalczyk everything she needs. Hannigan is the question." "Hannigan has been in the room with Ferrano for 30 years, Mateo said. "Not allied, but in the room. That kind of familiarity has weight." "More weight than instability?" "Depends on what kind of instability." She thought about this. "If Ferrano goes down hard, if the federal contact Voss introduced him to turns out to be what I think it is, the instability isn't Ferrano's fall. The instability is whatever comes after it." Mateo nodded slowly. "Hannigan needs to know that what I'm presenting isn't a void," she said. "It's a corrected record. The table functions after this. It functions better." She paused. "He needs to understand that the thing being removed was the instability." "Can you show him that?" "I can show him the shape of what was built without him knowing," she said. "A 3-year operation running underneath the table's awareness, with a federal insertion point that none of them sanctioned. If I frame it correctly, if I let the documents do the framing, the question he's answering isn't who he's loyal to. It's whether he knew. And if he didn't know, voting with Ferrano is the same as admitting complicity after the fact." Mateo looked at her across the kitchen table in the morning light, and there was something in his face that she hadn't seen from him before, and that she found, unexpectedly, difficult to look at directly. Not because it was hard to witness, but because it was the most unguarded thing she'd seen from a man who was constitutionally opposed to being unguarded. "You figured all of this out," he said, "in a kitchen at 9 in the morning on 4 hours of sleep." "I figured it out in the car at 4:30, she said. "I spent the kitchen time checking the arithmetic." He almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was the thing that happened to his face in the vicinity of a smile, a slight adjustment around the eyes and the set of the jaw. It was, she thought, probably what smiling looked like on a man who hadn't done it unselfconsciously in a very long time. "3 more days, she said. "3 more days, he said. Adrian Voss was held in a room on the 3rd floor that Matteo declined to describe in detail. On the 2nd day, Elena asked to speak with him. Matteo's expression when she asked was the expression he used when he was deciding whether to argue with something that he suspected he was not going to successfully argue with. He decided not to argue. She went upstairs. The room was small and had a window and a chair, and Adrian in the chair with his jacket folded over the arm of it, and his composure intact in the way that composure stays intact when it's the only thing left. He looked at her when she came in and showed no surprise, which was either genuine or performed, and with Adrian she was no longer sure the distinction mattered. "I want to understand one thing," she said. She stood near the door. She wasn't going to sit down. "The replacement, at the chapel, you knew about it in advance." He was quiet for a moment. "Doyle told me," he said. "Your stepmother contacted the household staff 3 days before the ceremony. She was looking for information about whether the substitution would be tolerated." He paused. "I encouraged Doyle to let it proceed. Because Serena was controllable. Because Serena was what that situation needed." He said it without inflection, without apology. The flat statement of a man describing a calculation he still considered valid. A woman with no interest in the operational side, no technical background, no reason to go near the archive. He looked at her with the gray-green eyes that were, she thought, the only genuinely unguarded thing about him. "You were a variable I hadn't accounted for." "Because my father saved 2 men from a fire." "Because your father made a promise to a dying man 22 years ago, and nobody thought anyone was still keeping track." He shifted slightly in the chair. "I didn't know about Matteo's actual reason for the arrangement until after it was already in motion. By then, changing it cleanly wasn't possible." He paused. "Encouraging the substitution was the next best option." She looked at him for a long moment. "You've been planning the exit from this organization for how long?" 2 years. "And Ferrano was a vehicle." He said it without hesitation. "A means of destabilizing Matteo's position to the point where my own exit would go unremarked. A sinking ship doesn't notice what the rats are doing." "And the federal contact Voss introduced to Ferrano." Something moved through his eyes. "Is not federal," she said. "I ran the name. He's private sector, corporate intelligence. He's been collecting information on multiple syndicate operations, not to prosecute, to sell." She kept her eyes on his. "To whoever in the legitimate business world needs to know which criminal organizations are managing which financial flows. Ferrano thinks he's building a case. He's been building someone else's portfolio." Adrian was still. "You knew," she said. He was quiet for 2 seconds. 3. "I suspected," he said. "I didn't verify." "Because if you'd verified and he wasn't federal, the leverage disappeared." "Because," he said slowly, "if I'd verified and he wasn't federal, I would have had to make a decision I wasn't ready to make." He looked at his hands. It was easier not to know. She stood with that for a moment. "It usually is," she said, and left. She did not sleep enough on any of the 3 days. She slept in the workroom chair and at the kitchen table, and once, on the 2nd night, in the actual bed for 4 hours before her mind pulled her back to the surface with the specific urgency of someone who has left something on the stove. She ate whatever Rosa put in front of her. She drank enough coffee to make her hands vibrate faintly at the edges of her awareness, a low electrical hum she'd learned to work through. She rebuilt the dress. Not the original. The original was hanging in the wardrobe, clean and pressed, the plain ivory she'd made by hand. She took the other dress, the one she'd brought from her own workroom in the first days of chaos, a midnight blue silk that she'd been making for a client who no longer needed it by the time she reached the Russo house. She took it apart and rebuilt it over 36 hours of intermittent work between the documents and the timeline and the 3 pages of Mateo's handwriting. She put in the hidden pockets, deeper than usual, lined with a secondary layer of interfacing to give them structure. She stitched the coded embroidery into the hem. Not decorative, not truly, though it looked decorative. The pattern was the cross-reference, account numbers rendered in a visual cipher she'd developed over years of working with the kind of wealthy clients who needed certain information to travel discreetly. Numbers that looked like flowers, sequences that looked like vines. The proof, sewn into the lining. She didn't do it because she needed to carry the documents this way. She did it because it was the way she knew how to carry things, close, hidden, part of the structure of what she wore. Because she had learned in the first 31 years of her life and confirmed in the last 7 days that the only things that were truly safe were the things you could carry on your body without anyone knowing they were there. On the morning of Friday, Mateo knocked on the workroom door. She opened it. He looked at the dress on the form behind her and then at her, and the look was long enough to say several things without saying any of them. "Ready," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "No," she said. "But that's probably correct." The table met in a building downtown that presented itself to the world as the offices of a mid-sized import consulting firm. The 8th floor. A conference room with a long oval table and 12 chairs, 7 of which would be occupied today, and windows that looked north toward the lake. They went in together. Her and Mateo and Doyle, who had spent 3 days with the particular gray look of a man who has made his accounting and found himself significantly short, and who had agreed, with the mechanical compliance of someone who has run out of options, to present the substituted documents as evidence of his own actions rather than Mateo's. Rosa drove. Nobody spoke in the car. Ferrano was already there when they arrived. He sat at the far end of the table in another excellent suit, with Mira Vance 2 chairs to his left, and he watched Elena walk in with the midnight blue dress and the document case under her arm, and his face showed the same precise, calibrated assessment she'd seen in the warehouse office. Threat evaluation, always, running just beneath the surface of everything else. Hannigan sat to Ferrano's right, large, Irish-faced, with the watchful stillness of a man who had spent 40 years in rooms where the wrong reaction cost more than the wrong words. Kowalczyk was across from him, in charcoal wool, with reading glasses she hadn't put on yet, and a legal pad and a pen. Osei was at the near end, near Mateo's side of the table, with a tablet and the particular alertness of someone who expected today to be more interesting than he'd been told. The 7th seat was taken by a man Elena didn't know, older in his 70s, who Mateo had told her held the seat as a procedural position, a chair that existed to provide quorum but that rarely influenced outcome. The chair at the head of the table was traditionally Mateo's. He sat in it. Elena sat to his right. She set the document case on the table in front of her and put both hands flat beside it, and looked at the table and breathed. Ferrano spoke first. He was, she acknowledged, very good at this. The way he laid out his case was not aggressive. It was the presentation of a man who had assembled evidence carefully and was allowing it to speak with minimal editorial. He walked through the documented transfers, the account structures, the timeline of financial movement through the Russo textile holdings. He had a printed summary. He distributed it. He named Mateo once, directly, with the restraint of a man who understood that naming him less would be more effective. A single clear attribution, supported by 3 years of documentation, delivered without heat. It took 22 minutes. Hannigan listened with the stillness he'd walked in with. Kowalczyk took notes. Osei read the printed summary with the focused attention of someone cross-referencing it against something internal. The older man at the 7th seat watched the ceiling. When Ferrano finished, he looked at Elena. Not at Mateo, at her. The assessment was, by now, almost familiar. She read it the way she read worn fabric, knowing what it meant, knowing where it was under stress. "Mrs. Russo," he said, not unkind, the acknowledgement of a genuine opponent. She opened the document case. Batata. She did not speak for the first 4 minutes. She distributed the printed timeline, the parallel columns, the dates and accounts and amounts, and authorizing signatures. and she let the table read. She watched them read. She watched Kowalczyk's pen stop moving. She watched Osei set down his tablet. She watched Hannigan's stillness acquire a different quality, the stillness of someone who has encountered an unexpected weight. She watched Ferrano look at the columns and understand, in the specific and immediate way of a man who had built the thing being described, what she had. Then she spoke. She spoke for 31 minutes without notes. She didn't need notes because she had built this and carried it and rebuilt it over 4 days until it was as much a part of her internal architecture as the dress on her back. She walked through the timeline the way she'd walk a client through a cutting diagram. Here's this piece. Here's where it fits. Here's what it becomes when you put it next to this other piece. She made no accusations that the documents didn't make for her. She asked no one to believe her. She showed them the shape and let the shape speak. She showed them the substituted documents and the originals side by side. She showed them the paperweight difference. She had sent a sample of each to a materials lab on the second day and had the lab report, and she read the relevant conclusion in the flat, factual language of a technician who had no stake in the outcome. She showed them Doyle's signature on the substitution request, time-stamped within 6 hours of her first inquiry. She showed them A. Voss. She showed them the Castellan cross-reference. She showed them what that meant for the integrity of the case Ferrano had built, not destroying it, but interrogating it, showing the table that the architecture of the case had been constructed with Adrian Voss's hands on 2 of its load-bearing walls. And she showed them the corporate intelligence firm. She had verified it on the second day, cross-referencing the name Adrian had let slip in the warehouse against public registry filings in 3 states. The firm was real, legitimate, and had no federal affiliation of any kind. It sold financial intelligence to corporate clients. She had a list of its publicly disclosed clients. She'd found it in a business journal profile from 18 months ago. And she set the printed list on the table and let the table read it. Ferrano was very still. The information you provided to this contact, she said, addressing him directly, about the financial flows through this organization and others, that information is currently held in a private commercial database being sold to interested parties in the legitimate business sector. She kept her voice entirely without heat. You were not building a legal case. You were building someone else's product. The silence at the table had a specific texture. Hannigan broke it. Who verified this? He said. Not aggressive. The flat question of a man who needed to know. I did, she said. The documentation is in the packet. Page 11. He found page 11, read it. Kowalczyk had already found it. She had her reading glasses on now, and her pen was moving again, and the quality of her movement had changed. Not notes anymore, but annotations. The marks of someone building her own analysis in the margins of someone else's. Osei looked up from his tablet. The lab report on this document substitution, he said. This is an independent lab. Yes. The receipt and chain of custody are on page 7. He found page 7. Ferrano said, This doesn't address the fundamental. Mr. Ferrano, Kowalczyk's voice. She did not raise it. She did not need to. Please. Ferrano stopped. Kowalczyk looked at Elena. The look was direct and without warmth, but also without hostility. The look of a woman who had spent 8 years being evaluated by people who didn't want her in the room and had developed an immunity to the pressure of being seen. The substituted documents, you're saying Doyle created them. Doyle has acknowledged this, Elena said. He's prepared to present that acknowledgement formally. And the original documents, the ones we're looking at, these came from Ferrano's own archive. Yes, she paused, with Mr. Ferrano's cooperation. Kowalczyk looked at Ferrano. Ferrano looked at the table. The silence extended itself. The corporate intelligence firm, Hannigan said. You said they're selling the information. He looked at the list on page 11. To these clients. That's the disclosed client list. The undisclosed list is likely longer. Hannigan looked at the list for a long time. She watched him look at it. She watched the moment when he found whatever name or category of name his eye had been moving toward. And she watched his jaw set, and she understood, without being able to see exactly what he'd seen, that whatever it was the thing that would determine his vote. He set the list down. He looked at Ferrano. He said nothing. But the look said the thing that his voice had chosen not to, and it said it clearly enough that Ferrano received it and looked, for the first time since Elena had walked in, like a man sitting in a chair rather than occupying one. They voted at 1:15 in the afternoon. The motion was procedural, a finding on the integrity of the documentation presented by both parties, to be followed by a formal recommendation. The table had its own language for these things, its own careful bureaucratic structure that existed, Elena understood, not despite the nature of what it governed, but because of it. Precision of process was the thing that kept the whole arrangement from collapsing into pure force. Kowalczyk voted first, in Mateo's favor. Ose, second, in Mateo's favor. The seventh seat man, the procedural presence, voted with the apparent majority as he always apparently did, and the majority was already established before Hannigan spoke. Hannigan looked at Ferrano for a long moment before he voted. The look was not unkind. It was the look of a long familiarity being formally concluded, the specific expression of a man who had known someone for 30 years and was now performing, with full awareness, the last act of that knowledge. He voted in Mateo's favor. The older man at the seventh seat made it 5-2, which was the kind of number that ended conversations. Ferrano's 4 had become 2. Himself and Mira Vance, who held no formal seat but whose presence at the table had been understood by everyone as his margin. The margin that Adrian Voss's cross-reference had dismantled before the vote was called. The room was quiet after. Not the quiet of an ending, exactly. The quiet of something that had been in motion for a long time suddenly stopping, the way a machine sounds different when it's off than when it was first turned on, the silence carrying the shape of what had run through it. Ferrano stood. He straightened his jacket. He looked at Elena once, the assessment, for the last time, running through his gray eyes. And then he nodded, once, with the controlled acknowledgement of a man who recognized a clean loss and did not intend to cheapen it by refusing to acknowledge it. "Friday," he said. It was the last word he spoke in the room. He walked out with Mira behind him, and the door closed, and the table sat with the aftermath, and Elena set both hands flat on the surface in front of her and pressed down until she could feel the edge of the table against her palms, and breathed. Margaret came to the house that evening. Elena had been expecting it, in the abstract, the way you expected weather, not the specific timing, but the inevitability. Her stepmother arrived at 7 with the charcoal silk and the borrowed jewelry and the expression of serenity she used when she needed to present herself as still in command of something. Rosa showed her to the sitting room. Elena came down alone. Margaret was standing at the window that looked toward the lake. She turned when Elena entered and looked at her daughter, her stepdaughter, in the midnight blue dress with the embroidered hem and the document case set aside on the writing desk, and her expression shifted through several things quickly before settling on the one she'd prepared. "I heard it went well today," Margaret said. Elena sat in the chair across from the window. She did not offer Margaret a seat. "Where did you hear that?" "People talk." "They do." Margaret looked around the room. She looked at it the way she looked at most things, assessing, calculating. The habitual inventory of a woman who had spent her life determining the value of environments she had not earned access to. "It's a good house." "Yes." "Serena is, She stopped, revised. "Serena is having a difficult time." "I imagine she is." She didn't understand what was happening. At the chapel, she thought she was getting something she wanted, Elena said. "She usually does. You usually ensure it." She kept her voice entirely without anger, because she had discovered over 4 days of working in a room above this one that anger was a thing she could no longer spend on Margaret. Not because she didn't have it, but because spending it would require giving her stepmother something, and she had decided sometime in the last 72 hours that the giving was over. "She's welcome to come here if she needs support, within appropriate limits." Margaret looked at her. The serenity shifted slightly. The top layer of it, the way a tide shifts to show what's underneath. "You've changed." "I've been in several rooms in the past week where changing was the only available option," Elena said. "I chose to keep up." "Elena, the debt," Elena said. Mateo will send you the documentation showing the balance cleared. It was part of the original arrangement, and that arrangement holds. She looked at her stepmother directly. The favors stop. The access stops. If you need money, there are legal means of generating it, and I'll direct you to them once. She paused. Once. Margaret stood at the window and looked at her stepdaughter in the other woman's house, in the other woman's dress, and the expression that finally arrived on her face was not the prepared serenity or the practiced sorrow or the strategic apology. It was something older and smaller and considerably more honest than any of those. The look of a woman who had just understood, in the specific way that took too long because she had been looking away for years, that the child she had undervalued had outgrown the space she'd been assigned. She didn't say anything else. She left. Elena sat alone in the sitting room for a while after. The lake was going dark outside the window, and the city was making its low, continuous sound, and she sat and let the quiet be what it was, which was not peaceful exactly, but was real, and real was what she could work with. She found Mateo in the garden. It was past 8, and the cold had settled in properly. The deep Midwestern cold that came off the lake in October and meant what it said. And he was sitting on the stone bench at the far end with his jacket on and a glass in his hand that she suspected had not been refilled since he'd poured it, because it was not a drinking for pleasure posture. It was a sitting with something posture. She crossed the wet grass in the flat-soled shoes and sat beside him on the bench. He looked at her, then at the garden, then at the glass. Doyle is gone, he said. Not gone as in... He paused. Gone as in left the city. I gave him that. I don't know if I should have. You gave him what 14 years was worth, she said. That seems correct. The organization needs a new archive manager. I'll do it, she said. Temporarily, until you find someone you trust. He looked at her. I already know the system, she said. I built a significant portion of its current index over the last 4 days. You built a case presentation and rebuilt a dress and reorganized my archive in 4 days. I sleep poorly, she said. I used the time. He almost did the thing with his face again. The almost smile, the adjustment. This time it went slightly further. Voss, he said. I've been thinking about what he said, that he was hedging. He was, Elena said. He was also running and using Ferrano's operation as cover for the run. Both things were true simultaneously. She paused. He's not a good man, but the information he gave us was accurate. I know. A pause. I'm trying to determine what to do with the combination. Let him go, she said. What he took, take back through whatever legal mechanisms are available. Document it properly. Then let him leave. She looked at the garden. He's going to spend the rest of his life knowing that the plan he built to escape this place was undone by a woman he tried to keep out of it. That's not nothing. Mateo was quiet for a moment. You're more merciful than I am, he said. I'm not merciful, she said. I'm practical. Keeping him close costs more than it recovers. And I have better things to spend the organization's energy on. He looked at her. Our organization, she said, and the words sat between them with the specific weight of a thing being said for the first time after it had been true for a while without being named. The garden was quiet. The lake beyond the wall made its low sound. A light in an upper window of the house went on and then off. Rosa, completing whatever Rosa's final rounds of the evening involved. I want to ask you something, Mateo said. Ask. The night in the archive, the first night, before any of this. He turned the glass in his hands. You'd been in the house for 16 hours. You were in a room full of documents belonging to a man you'd been married to for 8 hours. You found something wrong in the numbers. He looked at her. What made you keep going instead of coming upstairs and telling me what you'd found and letting me handle it? She thought about the honest answer. It took a moment to find because it was underneath several less honest ones. I didn't know yet if you were part of it, she said. He was still. I had no reason to trust you, she said. I had reasons to trust the arrangement, and I had reasons to believe you were a man who paid his debts. But trust is different. Trust requires evidence and time, and I had been in the house for 16 hours. She looked at him. So I decided to find out what was actually there before I decided who to bring it to. And then you found Doyle. And then I found Doyle, and I made a judgment call about who the problem was and who it wasn't. She paused. I could have been wrong. Were you? No, she said. But I could have been. He looked at her with the bourbon eyes in the low light, and she looked back and held it the way she'd been learning to hold it, directly, without the careful professional distance she'd been using as insulation in the first days. The distance was still there, but it was a different kind of distance now, the distance of two people who had been through the same fire and were standing on the same side of it, looking back at where it had been. The freedom, he said. What I offered you before the ceremony, before any of this. He set the glass on the bench beside him. The offer still stands. If you want out of this house, this arrangement, this... I know, she said. You don't have to... Mateo. His name, in her mouth, had become something she used differently now than the first time. Not as a tool of redirection, but as itself, the specific address of a specific person. I know the offer stands, you've made that clear. She looked at the garden, at the wall, at the dark shape of the city beyond it. I'm staying. Because of the arrangement. Because I made a choice, she said. And it turns out the choice was better than I had information to predict at the time. She paused. That's not the same as the arrangement. The arrangement is what brought me here. The choice is mine. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, The dress today. Yes. The embroidery on the hem. She looked down at the midnight blue silk in the garden light, the pattern that looked like flowers. Account numbers, she said. The cross-reference, the proof. She smoothed the fabric with one hand. Old habit. I carry important things in the structure of what I wear. In case. In case, she said. There's always a case. He reached out and touched the hem where the embroidery was. A brief, careful gesture, the touch of someone handling something they understood the value of. Then he withdrew his hand and looked at it for a moment as if slightly surprised by what it had done. I didn't introduce you correctly at the table today, he said. You introduced me accurately. Mrs. Russo. I should have said more than that. You said what the table needed to hear, she said. The table needed to hear that you had someone in that chair beside you who was there by your choice and who held an appropriate position. What I was there to do, I did myself. She paused. That's how it should work. He was quiet for a moment, then, my equal. She looked at him. I should have said it there, he said, the way it needed to be said, in that room, with those people. He held her eyes. My equal. Not possession, not asset, not... It's all right, she said. It's not, he said. It matters. She sat with that for a moment. The cold was very real, and the bench was hard stone, and somewhere across the city her stepmother was going home to the house that was now genuinely hers, and Serena was whatever Serena was, and Adrian Voss was somewhere counting the cost of his hedge, and Marcus Ferrano was sitting with the understanding that 30 years of relationship had been insufficient cover for the exposure of a single corporate intelligence filing. All of it was real, and all of it was done. And what remained was this: a garden in October, a man on a bench, 4 days of work built into the hem of her dress. Say it now, she said. It still counts. He looked at her. My equal, he said. And it was said the way she'd asked for it, not as a declaration, not as a performance, not as something produced for a room, said the way things were said when they were simply true, and the only appropriate response to truth was to speak it. She nodded. They sat in the garden while the city made its sounds around the wall, and after a while she picked up his glass and drank from it. It was scotch, good scotch, the kind that confirmed what her mind had been filing under bourbon for a week, and set it back down between them on the bench. Tomorrow, she said, I'm going to my shop. I'll have someone drive you. I'll drive myself. A pause. I'll have someone available if you want them. That's different, she said. That's acceptable. The city settled into its late-night register around them. She sat in the plain cold and thought about the shop, the orders that were behind, the client she'd need to call, the particular smell of fabric and chalk and machine oil that was the closest thing she had to the smell of herself. of the life she'd built in the years before anyone had thought to ask who she was or what she could see. She thought about going back to it not as a return but as a continuation. The seamstress who had spent 7 days in a room she hadn't chosen and had made of it something neither the room nor the people in it had been prepared for. She thought about her father pulling 2 men from a burning building because they were there and he had hands. She thought about character carrying. "You should have that cut looked at," she said. The one on his cheek, from the warehouse. 3 days old now and healing, but improperly. She could see the edge of it from where she sat. Rosa said the same. "Rosa is right." "Rosa is always right," he said. "It's one of her more exhausting qualities." She stood. He stood. They were standing on the same dark grass in the same cold air, and the space between them was the specific, honest distance of 2 people who were still learning what the other one was. Not the distance of strangers, and not yet the distance of people who had stopped measuring, but somewhere in the middle, somewhere still in motion. "Come inside," she said. He picked up the glass. He followed her across the garden, and she heard the grass under his feet, and the low sound of the lake, and the city, and the specific October silence that was not silence at all, but the accumulated sound of everything continuing despite everything. The city persisting in its low roar, the lake persisting in its cold weight, the world making no concession to what had happened in it this week, and requiring none in return. Inside, the house was warm and lit and quiet. Rosa had gone. The kitchen was clean. The workroom upstairs had the lamp still burning. She'd forgotten it. And the light came through the gap under the door and fell on the hallway floor in a thin gold line. She went up and turned off the lamp. She stood in the dark workroom for a moment with her hand still on the lamp switch, looking at the table where the files had been, the dress form with its finished shape, the cabinet with the tools she'd carried from every workspace she'd ever had. The room smelled like all workrooms smelled, thread and chalk and the specific clean dryness of fabric that had been handled carefully. It smelled like work. It smelled like hers. She took the folding knife from her pocket and set it on the table. She opened the cabinet and found the pin cushion and the measuring tape and the specialty needles in their box, and the particular satisfaction of things in their places, tools accounted for, inventory complete. Then she closed the cabinet and turned and walked out of the workroom and down the hall, and the house held its warmth around her, and she did not look back at the closed door or the finished dress or the knife on the table. She left them where they were, the way you left the work when the work was done, because the work had been done well, and the only thing left was the day that came after it. And the day that came after it was already here. And it was for the first time in as long as she could precisely remember, entirely and completely hers.